Chapter 25. Wednesday, 18th of September, 1811. Early the next morning, Sir Henry Lovejoy was just leaving his bed when one of his constables banged at his door. "What is it, Bernard?" Henry asked when the constable came stomping in, bringing with him the cold damp of the morning. "You know that case you was telling us about yesterday? The one you think might be linked to some poem about mermaids and mandrake roots?" Henry felt a twist of anxiety deep within his being. "Yes?" Bernard ran a hand across his beard-roughened face. "I think there's something down near the docks you need to see." In the dim light of dawn, the forest of masts out on the river were mere ghostly things without form or function. Sir Henry Lovejoy thrust his hands into the pockets of his greatcoat and suppressed a shiver. The mist coming off the water swirled around him, cold and damp, and smelling strongly of hemp and tar and dead fish.
"Oi, you there!"
The bulky form of a constable appeared out of the gloom. "Take nobody allowed any further here. Orders of Bow Street." "Sir Henry Lovejoy, Queen Square," snapped Henry. He brushed past the constable, his footsteps echoing on the wooden planking of the docks. He could see a knot of men clustered near an old warehouse up ahead. Henry paused, aware of a hollowness yawning deep inside and trying to swallow the thickness that had come to his throat. The sight of violent death was never easy for Henry. He had to steel himself for the sight of yet another human being butchered like a side of beef. At Henry's approach, one of the men near the warehouse straightened and came toward him. A fleshy man with protruding, watery grey eyes and loose, wet lips, Sir James Reed was one of Bow Street's 3 serving magistrates, a small-minded man Henry knew to be both ambitious and fiercely jealous of his dignity.
"Sir Henry,"
said the magistrate, with a show of bluff good humour,
"no need for you to have braved the cold on such a foul morning. This one had the courtesy to get himself oft well away from Queen Square."
The Thames side docks in the city fell under the authority of Bow Street, and Sir James's words were carefully chosen to let Henry know his presence here was both unnecessary and unwelcome. Henry looked beyond the magistrate to the shadows of the warehouse.
"I heard the victim has a mandrake root stuffed in his mouth."
Sir James's show of bluff good humour slipped away.
"Well, yes. What has that to say to anything?"
"I believe this gentleman's death may be linked to the recent murders of Mr. Barclay Carmichael and young Dominic Stanton."
"You mean the butcher of the West End?"
Sir James gave a harsh laugh.
"Hardly. No one's been carving up this gentleman."
Henry knew a moment's confusion.
"The body wasn't mutilated?"
"No, just a neat knife wound through the side. And that bloody mandrake root in his mouth, of course." Henry let his gaze drift around the docks. In the growing light he could now make out the dark hulls of the ships lying at anchor out on the river. He had to force himself to bring his gaze back to the sprawled figure beside the warehouse. The man lay on his back, one leg buckled awkwardly to the side, as if he'd simply been left where he had collapsed. No butchering of the body, no careful display of the remains. The cause of death was different as well, a knife wound to the side rather than a quick slitting of the throat from behind. Yet the presence of the mandrake root in the man's mouth surely tied this man's death to the murders of Thornton, Carmichael, and Stanton. So why the differences? Henry's footsteps echoed dully as he approached the body. No one had covered the man up. He lay with his eyes staring vacantly, the features of his face relaxed in death. He was young, as Henry had known he would be, probably somewhere in his early 20s. A handsome young man with light brown hair and even features, and the sun-darkened skin of a man who lives his life on the sea. He wore the uniform of a lieutenant in His Majesty's Navy, the brass of his buttons and buckles neatly polished.
"He's a naval lieutenant,"
said Henry.
"That's right. Lieutenant Adrian Bellamy, From HMS Cornwall, a far cry from the likes of your banker's son and future peer."
It was said with a faint sneer that Henry ignored.
"How long has the Cornwall been in port?" "Put in Monday night, I believe. They were meant to sail again at the end of the week."
Lovejoy frowned. It had been less than a week since Mr. Stanton's murder, which meant that after leaving a lapse of 2 or more months between his other killings, their murderer had struck again within days. Why?
"You've spoken to the captain of the Cornwall?" Henry asked. "Of course. According to the captain, the lad came ashore last night after receiving a message." "From whom?" "From his family, it would seem. At least, he told the captain he was going to visit them in Greenwich."
Sir James stared down at the body at their feet. For a moment, the cloak of bluff insensitivity slipped, and a muscle ticked along the man's fleshy jawline.
"He didn't make it far, did he?"
"No," said Henry.
"No, he didn't."
Chapter 26. Sebastian found Sir Henry seated behind his desk in Queen's Square. The magistrate had his head bowed, his forehead furrowed by a frown as he scribbled furiously on a notepad.
"I heard about Lieutenant Bellamy," said Sebastian, as soon as the clerk Collins had bowed himself out.
Sir Henry removed the small set of spectacles he wore perched on the end of his nose, and rubbed the bridge.
"It's puzzling, most puzzling. There was no mutilation of the body, and the young man was killed by a knife wound to the side. Yet the presence of that mandrake root surely links his murder to the other 3. "I would have said so."
Sir Henry picked up a volume from his desk-top and rose from his chair.
"When I saw him on the docks, Sir James was dismissive of my conclusions. I then spoke to his colleagues, Eyre and Graham, and Sir William, and presented them with my notes on the case. Both agreed the evidence suggests the death of Mr. Nicholas Thornton may well be linked to the murders of Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Stanton. However, they remain sceptical of the relevance of the poem by John Donne. They therefore agree with Sir James that the docks killing is unrelated to the other 3.
Sebastian watched the magistrate lock the volume away in a glass-fronted case beside the door.
"And they've taken over the investigation?" "Yes. It was inevitable, given the breadth of the case."
Sebastian nodded. Bow Street was the first public office formed in London back in 1750. The original Bow Street magistrate had been Henry Fielding, followed by his brother John. Together, the brothers had been so successful at stemming the rampant spread of crime in the growing metropolitan area that another 6 public offices were established in 1792, including the one at Queen's Square. But of them all, only the magistrates of Bow Street exercised authority over the entire metropolitan area and beyond. Bow Street's famous runners operated the length of England.
"My jurisdiction is limited," Sir Henry was saying. "Technically, I should have contacted Bow Street after our discoveries in Kent."
Sebastian watched Sir Henry resume his seat behind the desk.
"So what can you tell me about Adrian Bellamy?" "Little you won't be able to read in the papers, I'm afraid. The young man was from Greenwich. His father is one Captain Edward Bellamy." "Also a Navy man?" "No. Retired merchant captain."
Sir Henry hesitated, then said,
"The differences in the murders are considerable, not simply in the manner of killing and the lack of mutilation, but in other ways as well. Bellamy was left where he fell, in the shadow of one of the warehouses beside the docks. There was no public display of the remains, no flaunting of what had been done."
"Perhaps the killer was pressed for time," Sebastian suggested. Lovejoy carefully fitted his spectacles back on his face.
"You may be right. You were certainly correct about the mandrake root. It's as if the killer deliberately skipped that line of the poem, fully intending to return to it later. But why? Because Bellamy's ship was out of port. The designated victim was beyond his reach. Sir Henry looked at Sebastian over the top of the spectacles. You think he's putting his victims in some sort of order? So it would appear. Teach me to hear mermaids singing, whispered Sir Henry. What? It's the next line of the poem. Teach me to hear mermaids singing. If he's putting his victims in order, he must already have the next one selected. Sebastian blew out his breath in a harsh sigh, and Bow Street doesn't believe any of it. Chapter 27. Sebastian studied his reflection in the mirror, then leaned forward to add a touch more ash to his hair, blending it in until he gave all the appearance of a man just beginning to go grey. He wore a decidedly unfashionable coat and sturdy breeches of a cut that would give his Aunt Henrietta an apoplexy if she were to see them, for they had come not from the exclusive shops of Bond Street, but from a second-hand clothing dealer in Rosemary Lane. There were times when Sebastian's aristocratic bearing and the trappings of wealth gave him a decided advantage, but there were other times when it served his purpose better to pretend to be someone else. He was just slipping a slim but deadly knife into a sheath in his right boot when Tom came hurtling into the dressing-room, bringing with him the scent of the rain that had been threatening all morning. "There's something you might want to know about that captain in the Horse Guards, that Captain Quayle you asked me to trail. I think he might have run into debt. Seems his wife threatened to leave him if he didn't spend more time with her. And seeing as her Da's the one with all the blunt, that's why he's been sticking pretty close to home." Sebastian kept his attention on the task of tying his dark cravat. "Keep looking into it when you have the chance. There's no doubt the man's hiding something. I'm just not certain it's related." Tom eyed Sebastian's unfashionable rig. "What's this for, then?" Sebastian adjusted his modest shirt points. "Greenwich." He turned away from the mirror. "How would you like to take a ride on a hoy?" "Cool," said Tom, on a breath of pure ecstasy as the hoy slid past the Tower of London and the docks beyond, past merchantmen lying heavy in the water with their cargoes of sugar and tobacco, indigo and coffee, their masts thick against the cloud-filled sky. Sebastian stood at the rail, the moist wind cool against his face as he watched the Tiger dart from one side of the boat to the other, dodging coiled lines and scattered crates and some 6 fellow passengers. Sebastian smiled to himself. "Ever been to Greenwich?" Tom shook his head, his eyes wide, as the hoy slipped past the massive bulk of India House, and, beyond that, the docks and warehouses of the West India Trading Company on the Isle of Dogs. "We should have time to take a look at the Queen's House and the Naval Academy, if you're interested." "And the observatory?" Sebastian laughed. "And the observatory." Tom squinted up at the rusty red-brown canvas flapping in the wind. The hoy was spritsail-rigged, with a topsail over a huge mainsail and a large foresail. Its flat-bottom design made it perfect for the shallow waters and narrow rivers of the Thames estuary it plied. "This cove you want me to nose out about, this Captain Edward Bellamy, what you expecting to find?" "I'm hoping for something that might link either the captain or his son to Carmichael, Stanton, and Thornton." Tom screwed up his face. "It don't seem likely. A clergyman, a ship's captain, a banker, and a lord?" "You'd be surprised at the threads that can bind one man to the next across all levels of society. Or one woman to the next." "You want I should listen to the jabber about Mrs. Bellamy while I'm at it? If there is one?" A line from Donne's poem kept running through Sebastian's head. "And swear, nowhere, lives a woman true and fair." It had occurred to him that he'd given little thought to the mothers of these murdered young men, The Reverend's recently dead wife, Mary Thornton. Lady Stanton, who'd insisted her son return early for her dinner party and was now said to be so hysterical her doctors were keeping her sedated. And Barclay Carmichael's mother, the Marquis's daughter, the woman who tended to the needs of the working poor and had lobbied her husband to limit the hours laboured by children in his factories and mines. He'd been focused on finding a tie among the young men's fathers. Yet, couldn't the link as easily lie with the victims' mothers? Sebastian settled back against the rail. I think that might be a good idea. Chapter 28. Captain Edward Bellamy lived in a sprawling, white-framed house trimmed with dark green shutters and set in expansive gardens overlooking the river. Slipping into the demeanour of Mr. Simon Taylor of Bow Street, Sebastian climbed the short flight of steps to the front door and worked the knocker. His peal was answered by a slip of a tow-headed housemaid, who looked to be no more than 14 or 15. She started to deny both her master and mistress, but hesitated when Sebastian removed his hat and said loftily, "Mr. Simon Taylor from Bow Street, please announce me." The little housemaid opened her eyes wide and scuttled off. Captain Bellamy proved to be a tall man, well over 6 feet, and robust, despite his 60-plus years. A life at sea had given him a weathered, deeply grooved face, and left his flaxen hair liberally streaked with white. His stunned grief at the death of his son could be read in every feature. He received Sebastian in a spacious sitting-room overlooking the gardens and the river beyond. With him sat a small olive-skinned woman with dark hair and liquid brown eyes, her pretty unlined face streaked with tears. Looking at her, Sebastian at first assumed her to be the murdered man's sister, but Bellamy introduced her as his own wife. "My apologies for intruding on you at such a time," said Sebastian, bowing low over her hand. "Please, sit down," she said in Portuguese-accented English. "Brandy?" offered the captain in a very gruff voice, going to lift the stopper from a crystal decanter on a nearby table. Sebastian took a seat on a graceful settee covered with green and cream striped silk. "Thank you, but no." He let his gaze drift around the room. It was elegantly furnished, with heavy mahogany tables and glass-fronted cases filled with everything from Chinese jade carvings and delicate ivory statues to Murano glass from Venice. Captain Bellamy had obviously prospered in his voyages. "A constable who was here this morning said someone would be calling later," said Bellamy, splashing a hefty measure of brandy into a glass for himself. "But I must admit I hadn't expected to see you so soon. Bow Street is most anxious to come to a better understanding of this dreadful series of killings." Bellamy paused with his glass raised halfway to his lips. "Series of killings? What other killings are you referring to?" "The recent murders of Barclay Carmichael and Dominic Stanton." Bellamy took a long, slow swallow of his drink. What little colour he'd had seemed to drain from his face. "What makes you think my son's death is in any way related to the deaths of those other young men? My son was stabbed on the docks. What happened to young Carmichael and Stanton was an abomination. Whoever killed your son left a mandrake root in his mouth. Mr. Stanton was found with the severed hoof of a goat in his mouth, while Mr. Carmichael was found with a page torn from a ship's log. There's also another young man, a student of divinity at Cambridge named Nicholas Thornton, who was found with a papier-mâché star in his mouth. We believe all 4 killings are related in some way." Bellamy downed the rest of his brandy in one swallow and turned to pour another drink with a hand that was not quite steady. "I heard what happened to Carmichael and Stanton, but not Thornton." "When was that?" "Last April." "And he was butchered, like the others?" "Not exactly. Certain of his internal organs were removed.
"Mighty Deus," whispered Mrs. Bellamy, bringing a black-edged handkerchief to her lips.
Sebastian turned to her. "I beg your pardon, madam, but I must speak of these things."
"I don't understand," she said, her fist tightening around her handkerchief. "What does it all mean?"
"We believe the objects refer to a poem by John Donne. Go and catch a falling star. Do you know it?" "I know it," said Bellamy. He went to stand at the window overlooking the green sweep of the front garden and the river beyond. "But I don't understand what any of this has to do with my son. Are you in any way acquainted with Sir Humphrey Carmichael or Alfred Lord Stanton?" "No." "What about the Reverend William Thornton?" A muscle jumped along the captain's tight jaw. "Who is he?" "A clergyman at Avery, Kent, the father of the first murdered man." Bellamy shook his head. "No, I don't see how Adrian could have known any of them either. He was just a lad when he first went to sea. He was a midshipman on the Victory, you know." A father's pride shone through the heavy grief. "Saw action with Nelson at Trafalgar. I understand his ship docked in London just this week." "That's right. Monday." "Did you see him?" "Right after he docked. He gave me a tour of the Cornwall. They took on some damage when they captured an American merchantman trying to run the blockade last month. It's the reason they put into port." "Did you send a note last night asking your son to come to Greenwich?" The captain's face went slack. "No, of course not. Why? Did he receive such a note?" "So we understand, although the note itself has not been found." Sebastian watched Captain Bellamy move to pour himself another drink. He walked with the careful deliberation of a man who holds his liquor well, yet has been drinking heavily for some time. "You're from Greenwich, Captain Bellamy?" Bellamy shook his head and replaced the stopper on the carafe. "Gravesend. My father was a sea captain in his time, and his father before him." "What made you settle in Greenwich?" "My first wife was from Greenwich." "She was Adrian's mother?" "Yes. She died 14 years ago now." That must have been shortly before young James joined the Navy, Sebastian thought. He looked at the sultry Portuguese beauty, now sitting quietly, her gaze on her husband, and wondered if the captain's remarriage had precipitated his son's entry into the Navy. "You have other children?" "A daughter," said Mrs. Bellamy softly. Sebastian realized that she too was watching her husband's brandy consumption. A frown line had appeared between her brows. "Francesca. She is 12. "You're from Brazil?" he said, giving her a smile. She returned his smile shyly. "Yes. How did you know?" "I spent some time there when I was in the army." He glanced back at Bellamy. "You sailed to South America and the West Indies, I gather?" "Frequently, and to China and the East Indies, Africa and the Mediterranean. There are few places with a port I haven't been." "Spend much time in India?" Sebastian asked casually. Bellamy's eyes narrowed, and he took a sip of his drink before answering. "Been there many times. Why do you ask?" "His last voyage was to India," said his wife. Sebastian turned toward her. "When was that?" The woman faltered, aware of her husband's intense gaze upon her. 5 years ago, she said in a small voice. "This has all been most distressing for my wife." Bellamy came to stand behind her and rest a hand on her shoulder. "Perhaps we could continue the discussion some other time, Mr. Taylor." Sebastian met the captain's steely gaze. "Yes, of course." Sebastian pushed to his feet. "Someone from Bow Street will be contacting you again." "And no doubt asking some very different questions," thought Sebastian as he turned to leave. "Mrs. Bellamy?" Shown to the front door by the nervous little housemaid, Sebastian was letting himself out the garden gate when he became conscious of being watched. Tilting back his head, he looked up into a pair of big brown eyes framed by dark ringlets. A half-grown girl perched on the stout branch of the spreading oak that grew near the gate, her brown scratched legs dangling from beneath the torn hem of what had once been a neat muslin gown. "You must be Francesca," he said, tipping his head back farther. "How do you do?" She regarded him intently for a moment without smiling.
"Gilly says you're from Bow Street."
Gilly, Sebastian assumed, must have been the tow-headed housemaid who had opened the door to him. "Yes, I am." He executed a flourishing bow. "Mr. Simon Taylor, at your service, Miss Bellamy." She frowned.
"How do you know I'm Miss Bellamy?"
"I'm a detective. It's my job to know these things."
"Where's your baton?"
"I carry my baton only when I'm chasing criminals." She considered this explanation for a moment and didn't seem to find it wanting.
"Something's happened to Adrian, hasn't it?"
Sebastian felt an ache pull across his chest. They hadn't told her yet. How could they not tell her? "I'm afraid that's a question you'll have to ask your papa," he said.
"I know it's true. His ship's in, but he hasn't come home."
"Does Adrian usually come home when his ship is in port?"
She nodded. "He brings me presents."
She fished a silver chain from beneath the ruffled neck of her dress, a chain from which dangled a filigreed representation of a hand. The hand of Fatima.
"He brought me this from North Africa once."
"But he didn't bring you anything this time?"
"I don't know. Papa wouldn't let me go with him when he went to see Adrian."
"Did your papa say why Adrian wasn't coming home?"
"He said Adrian had to stay on his ship."
"Did he say why?"
She shook her head, her curls bouncing around her face. "Only that it would be better."
She slid from the tree in a rush to stand before him, all skinny arms and legs and big brown eyes.
"I saw Mrs. Clinton making a black wreath." "He's dead, isn't he?" "Adrian is dead."
"You ran out here and hid when you saw the wreath, did you?"
She nodded. "Mamma thinks I'm in my room."
"I think you need to go talk to your mamma."
Tears welled up in her eyes, one escaping to run down her cheek.
Sebastian watched, helpless, as another tear brimmed over to slide down her face, then another.
"Are you really a Bow Street runner?" she asked in a small broken voice.
"No."
"But you'll find out who killed Adrian, won't you?"
"How do you know someone killed him?"
"I know," she said, and Sebastian had no doubt that somehow she did.
Chapter 29. Sebastian noticed the man right away. He stood with one shoulder propped against the trunk of a chestnut tree near the banks of the river, his head half turned away so that Sebastian could see only his profile. Young and of medium height and build, the man wore a double-breasted olive coat with wide flaring lapels, full sleeves, and a long-tailed skirt. Once the coat must have come from a Bond Street tailor, but Sebastian suspected the coat, like the man's wide-brimmed hat and shiny leather breeches, had passed through one or two used clothing dealers before reaching its present owner. Sebastian had seen the man before, amongst a handful of fellow passengers on the hoy down from London. At the time, Sebastian had paid him little heed. Now, without looking at the man again, Sebastian closed Bellamy's gate behind him and turned toward the cluster of elegant 18th-century buildings that formed the heart of Greenwich. The olive-coated man lingered for a time, looking out over the wide expanse of the river. Then he pushed away from the tree to follow at a distance. The day was cool and overcast, with high white clouds. Sebastian crossed into the park, his gaze scanning the tree-shaded hillside for his tiger. He finally found the boy in a crowd of laughing children gathered before a Punch and Judy show. Tom threw one last look at the puppets, then came on the run, one elbow crooked skyward as he clapped his tiger's hat to his head. "Walk with me toward the top of the hill," said Sebastian as Tom came up to him. "There's a man following us. No, don't look back," he added hastily, when Tom's head jerked to do just that.
"Who is he?"
"I don't know. He followed us from London." At the top of the hill they paused to look back toward the river. From here they could see the white jewel known as the Queen's House, and beyond that the stately bulk of Wren's Naval College on the banks of the river. London was a vast crowded sprawl to the west, bristling with spires and towers. "See him now?" asked Sebastian, his gaze on the distant city.
"Aye."
"Did you notice him earlier, when you were asking questions around town?" Tom shook his head.
"No."
"Learn anything interesting about Captain and Mrs. Bellamy during the course of your perambulations?"
"Of my what?"
"Perambulations. Travels or inspections by foot."
"Oh, well, I heard this Mrs. Bellamy ain't the dead lieutenant's mum. She's Captain Bellamy's second wife. The captain's first wife died of consumption back in '97. It's her house they're living in now. Belonged to her da."
"And the neighbours are suspicious of the new Mrs. Bellamy because she's a foreigner."
Tom looked up in surprise. "How'd you know?"
"Lucky guess. What else do they say about her?"
"Not much, except that the captain is held to have married beneath him."
"Because she's from Brazil?"
"Because she can't read or write."
"Really? That's interesting."
"They've got a little girl, name of Francesca. Seems the lieutenant fair doted on her, even if she is half foreign."
"What do they say of the lieutenant himself?"
"Sounds to have been a likeable sort of lad when he were younger. Folks ain't seen him much since he joined the Navy."
"And the captain?"
"I'm thinking there's something queer about him, although no one would come right out and say it. He's been retired these last 5 years or so, ever since he lost his last ship."
Sebastian brought his full attention back to the tiger. "Really? What happened?"
"Come to grief in a storm. It were an East Indiaman, namer the Harmony."
Tom shifted restlessly from one foot to the other, his gaze drifting from the olive-coated man, now watching the Punch and Judy show, to the twin turrets of Flamstead House.
"What we going to do about that cove?"
"Let him follow us to the observatory if he likes." Tom's eyes shone with excitement. They turned together to descend the hill toward the neat 17th-century house designed by Wren himself. Sebastian's gaze narrowed as he studied the thunderheads building to the west. According to Adrian Bellamy's little sister, the lieutenant always came to see her whenever he was in port. Yet he didn't come this time. Instead, Captain Bellamy went to see him as soon as his ship docked. I'm wondering if Captain Bellamy didn't perhaps warn his son not to leave the ship, that his life was at risk.
"But the lieutenant did leave his ship."
"Someone sent him a note saying he was needed at home." Tom did a little skip.
"Maybe the killer's getting tired of having to follow these young gentlemen all over the place."
"Perhaps," said Sebastian. "Or perhaps he feels he's running out of time." The wind was stiffening when they boarded the hoy for the return journey up the Thames, the clouds hanging low and ominous. The river had turned into a dancing cauldron of choppy waves that filled the air with spray and set the small 80-foot-long boat to rocking and pitching against its moorings. Tom lurched up the gangplank, laughing as the deck rose up to meet him, then fell away sharply. While the boy darted across the deck, talking non-stop to the skipper and his mate, and setting the boat's dog to barking with excitement, Sebastian went to stand near the forward hatchway, his face turned toward the wind. The man in the olive coat was one of the last passengers to board. He went to lounge at the stern, his collar turned up against the mist-filled wind as the mate cast off, and the hoy pulled away from the wharf. The wind filled the brown canvas, setting the sails to snapping against the grey sky. Olivecoat braced his legs wide against the steep pitch and fall of the deck, like a man who'd spent his share of time at sea. It was some 10 minutes later that Sebastian noticed Tom had grown increasingly quiet. His mouth hung slack, and his skin had taken on a greenish hue. Sebastian hauled the boy up from behind the crate where he'd sought shelter, and half-steered, half-carried him to the bow. "You need air. Lots of air. No, don't watch the deck. Keep your eyes on the horizon. Pick a point in the distance and concentrate on it. It's no different from riding in a well-sprung carriage."
"I never wanted to empty my breadbasket in no carriage," said Tom, wiping his sleeve across his mouth.
Sebastian cast a glance back at the stern. Olivecoat was still there, his attention seemingly focused on the stately East Indiaman just off their port side, making its way downstream.
"How much longer?"
said Tom, in a small, reedy voice. Sebastian put a hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed.
"A while.
The hoy's lee boards allow for a fairly effective windward performance, but she's sitting low in the water. Her cargo's heavy." Tom groaned. The boy lost it a few times over the side, but he stayed at the rail, grim-faced and plucky, until the hoy bumped up against its London wharf. The air filled with the whine of lines being uncoiled, the salt-cracked voice of the skipper shouting his orders, the scrape of the gangplank being slid out at midship.
"Can I get off now?"
asked Tom. Sebastian glanced down at the boy's ashen cheeks. "You go ahead. I'll stay behind and keep an eye on our olive-coated friend. Just be careful on the gangplank. The spray will have made it slippery." Tom nodded, his step unsteady as he lurched to midship. Sebastian hung back, letting most of the other passengers push past him. He was aware of his olive-coated shadow doing the same, falling behind him as Sebastian moved toward the gangplank. Sebastian had taken one step, two, out onto the gangplank, when he felt a rough hand clap on his shoulder.
"He's got a knife!"
screamed Tom from the wharf. Sebastian dropped to one knee and spun around, his hands coming up to close on the man's outstretched arm and jerk him sideways. Caught off balance, the man staggered, his feet sliding on the wet wood, the knife clattering as it fell. Sebastian let go and ducked back. For one unforgettable moment their gazes locked. The young man's grey eyes widened with quick comprehension and terror, his arms windmilling as he sought to catch his balance. Sebastian surged up, reaching for him, but it was too late. The man pitched sideways off the gangplank to splash into the narrow triangle of water between the wharf and the hoy's hull. The air filled with the snap of canvas, the creak of timbers as the wind caught the hoy and swung it toward the wharf. The man's head surged up to break water, his eyes wild, his arms flailing as he sought to kick out of the way. The hoy's black hull loomed over him, smashing him against the wooden embankment with a grinding, sickening thwomp that shook the wharf and ended the man's scream.
"Bloody hell,"
whispered Tom. Chapter 30.
"Your inquiries are obviously making someone nervous," said Paul Gibson, leaning back in his chair.
They were in a coffee shop near the mall. The morning's fog had returned to settle over the city like a cold, wet blanket that spoke of the coming end to summer's balmy days and soft sunshine.
"Obviously,"
said Sebastian with a wry smile.
"The question is, who?"
The surgeon stared down at the hot steam rising from his coffee.
"Are you so certain this latest killing near the river is related to the other three? The docks are a dangerous place."
"What sort of dockside killer takes the time to stuff a mandrake root in his victim's mouth, but doesn't bother to relieve him of his purse and watch?"
"You do have a point.
But the method of killing is entirely different.
And there was no draining of the blood, no butchery of the corpse.
Sebastian leaned forward.
You talked to the surgeon who performed Bellamy's post-mortem?
A slow smile touched Gibson's eyes.
I thought you might be interested.
And?
The consulting surgeon found nothing beyond the stab wound, and the mandrake root, of course.
Sebastian frowned.
Perhaps the killer was interrupted. The other young men, Thornton, Carmichael, and Stanton, all seemed to have been waylaid and taken elsewhere to be killed. If Bellamy tried to resist his attacker, the murderer might have been forced to kill him on the spot. He wouldn't have been able to butcher the body in such a public place, so he simply left the mandrake root and fled.
The tramp of marching feet brought Sebastian's head around. Through the paned glass of the coffee shop's front window, he could see a troop of pressed men marching down the street on their way to the docks, and a life of service in His Majesty's Navy. Hemmed in close by their press gang, the men looked to range in age from 15 to 50, their faces haggard with fear, their wrists manacled like criminals.
"Poor bastards,"
murmured Gibson, following Sebastian's gaze.
"I never see the unlucky sods without thinking of that line from Rule Britannia. You know the one. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves."
Sebastian choked on his coffee, while Gibson leaned forward suddenly, his face intent.
"That poem you were telling me about, the one by Donne, it suggests a life spent in travel. Perhaps this Lieutenant Adrian Bellamy is the key to it all."
Sebastian shook his head.
"The man was at sea for half his life, since he was a lad. What kind of contact could he have had with the other three? No, I think the answer lies with the murdered men's fathers, or their mothers. An unfaithful woman, or unfaithful women."
Gibson ran a finger thoughtfully up and down the side of his cup.
"You say Reverend Thornton, Sir Humphrey Carmichael, and Captain Edward Bellamy have all visited India. What about Lord Stanton?" "I don't know yet, but they're all obviously hiding something, and at least one of them seems willing to kill me in order to conceal it."
"What kind of a man continues to hide a secret that puts his own children at risk?"
"All manner of men, or so it would seem."
Gibson stared out at the street, empty now in the flat light of the dying afternoon.
"It must be a terrible secret," he said, draining his cup to the dregs. "A terrible secret indeed."
Sebastian was walking up the Mall, headed for the public office in Queen Square, when he became aware of an elegant town carriage slowing beside him. Glancing sideways, Sebastian recognized the crest of Charles, Lord Jarvis, emblazoned on the carriage door. He kept walking.
"My lord!" A footman descended to hurry after him. "Lord Devlin, Lord Jarvis would like a word with you."
Sebastian kept walking.
"Tell his lordship I'm not interested."
He turned the corner. He was aware of the carriage turning with him, then heard the sound of a window being let down. Lord Jarvis's voice was pitched low, but Sebastian had no difficulty hearing his words over the clip-clop of horses' hooves and the rumble of passing carriage wheels.
"I know of your visit to Greenwich. I know Sir Henry Lovejoy asked for your assistance in solving this rather lurid series of murders, and I know that while Sir Henry has been removed from the investigation, you are obviously still determined to catch this killer."
Sebastian swung to face him.
"And?"
Jarvis gave a grim smile.
"And I know something that can help you."
Chapter 31. They faced each other across the elegant expanse of the library in Lord Jarvis's massive Berkeley Square townhouse.
"Why?"
Sebastian demanded.
"What is your interest in any of this?"
Jarvis drew a gold-enamelled snuff-box from his pocket.
"Have a seat."
"Thank you."
"What is your interest in this?" Sebastian demanded again.
Jarvis flicked open the snuff-box with one deft finger. "I brought you here because I'm concerned for the safety of my daughter, Hero." "Miss Jarvis?" The answer caught Sebastian by surprise. "What is she to do with any of this?" Jarvis lifted a pinch of snuff to one nostril and sniffed. "I had a son once, David. David was a year younger than Hero." Jarvis tucked his snuff-box away and dusted his fingers. "He was a strange child, very dreamy. At the age of 8, he announced he wanted to be a poet, but by the time he was 10, he decided he preferred to be an artist." Sebastian studied the big man's curling lip and narrowed eyes, but said nothing. Sebastian knew only too well what it was like for a son to disappoint his father, to never quite measure up to expectations. "He spent several years at Oxford," Jarvis was saying, "but found nothing to hold his interest. 6 years ago I sent David to my wife's younger brother, Sidney Spencer. Spencer's regiment was in India, and I thought the experience would do the boy good, toughen him up a bit." Sebastian sat forward, his attention now well caught. "And?" "The climate didn't agree with David. He was always sickly as a child, although it was my opinion that his mother and grandmother coddled him." Jarvis's jaw tightened. "After 8 months, Spencer decided to send him home." Sebastian thought he knew where this was going. "Let me guess. The ship was the Harmony, captained by Edward Bellamy." "That's right. All went well at first, but 3 days out of Cape Town, the ship was struck by a fierce storm that lasted days. Her sails were ripped asunder, her masts lost, her timbers strained and leaking badly. It seemed obvious to all aboard that the ship was sinking. Captain Bellamy prepared to abandon ship, but most of the ship's boats had been lost in the storm. Recognizing that there was not enough space for all those left alive, the ship's crew mutinied." "And took the remaining boat?" Jarvis nodded. "Along with most of the food and water. The captain, his officers, and the passengers were left to die." "So what happened?" Jarvis went to stand beside the empty hearth, one arm resting along the mantel. "The ship didn't sink. The captain and his officers managed to rig up a makeshift mast and sails, but it was useless. They were becalmed." "How long did it take the food and water to run out?" "Not long. They were a day or 2 from death when they were rescued by a naval frigate that happened to come upon them. HMS Sovereign." "And your son?" Jarvis turned his head away to stare down at the empty hearth. "David was injured in the mutiny. He died within hours of their rescue." Sebastian studied the big man's half-averted profile. His grief appeared genuine enough. Yet things were rarely as they seemed with this man. "I understand the connection to Adrian Bellamy, but what does any of this have to do with the murders of Dominic Stanton, Barclay Carmichael, and Nicholas Thornton?" Jarvis's head came up. "I don't know about Thornton, but Lord Stanton and Sir Humphrey Carmichael were both passengers on the Harmony." Sebastian frowned. When he'd asked Captain Bellamy if he'd known either Stanton or Carmichael, the captain had answered no. "You're certain?" "Of course I'm certain." Both men testified at the mutineers' trial. "The crew was caught?" "Caught and hanged, 4 years ago. The trial caused something of a sensation." Sebastian's eyes narrowed. 4 years ago he had been in the army on the continent. "What makes you think Miss Jarvis is in danger? You weren't on that ship. Her brother was." "And it's not Captain Bellamy, Sir Humphrey, or Lord Stanton who have died, but their sons." "David had no son, but Hero is his sister." From the street outside came a hawker's cry. "Cheers to mend! Oh, cheers to mend!" "How did you know I'd taken an interest in the murders?" "I know," Jarvis said simply. Sebastian turned toward the door. "Then I suggest you take some of your spies off the streets and set them to guarding your daughter. Good day, my lord." He expected Jarvis to stop him. He did not. But then it occurred to Sebastian that the big man had probably said all he'd intended to say. It was up to Sebastian to use the information or not, as he chose. He was crossing the hall when he encountered Miss Jarvis herself. She was a tall woman with plain brown hair, a direct grey gaze, and her father's aquiline nose. If ever there was a woman who could take care of herself, Sebastian had always thought, it was Jarvis's formidable daughter. "Good heavens," she said, pausing at the sight of him. "What are you doing here?" She tilted her head, making a show of studying him. "And not a gun or a knife in sight." The first time he'd encountered her here, in her father's house, he'd held a gun to her head and kidnapped her. He held up his empty hands and gave her a smile that showed his teeth. "Not in sight." The smile was not returned. The fiercely intelligent eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" "I suggest you ask your father." "I believe I shall." She headed toward the library door, pausing only to say over her shoulder, "Oh, do kindly refrain from kidnapping any of the maidservants on your way out, if you please." Chapter 32. For several years now, Sir Henry Lovejoy had made his home in a neat row house on Russell Square. The district was genteel, but far from fashionable, which suited Henry just fine. Once, Henry had been a moderately successful merchant, but the deaths of his wife and only daughter had wrought changes in his life. Henry had undergone a spiritual revelation that turned him toward the Reformist Church, and he had decided to devote the remainder of his life to public service. He now sat in his favourite chair beside the sitting-room fireplace, a rug tucked around his lap to help ward off the cold as he read. The fire was not lit. Henry never allowed a fire to be laid in his house before October the 1st or after March the 31st, no matter what the weather. But he felt the cold terribly, and was about to get up and ring for a nice pot of hot tea when he heard a knock at the door below, followed by the sound of voices in the hall. Mrs. McCoy, his housekeeper, appeared at the sitting-room door. "There's a Lord Devlin to see you, Sir Henry." "Good heavens!" Henry thrust aside the rug. "Show him up immediately, Mrs. McCoy, and bring us some tea, please." Lord Devlin appeared in the sitting-room doorway, his lean frame elegantly clad in the buckskin breeches and exquisitely tailored silk waistcoat and dark blue coat of a gentleman. "Well," said Henry, "I see you've put off your Bow Street raiment." Amusement gleamed in the Viscount's strange yellow eyes. "You've heard from Sir James, I take it?" "And Sir William. Please, have a seat, my lord." "Do they still doubt the relevance of Donne's poem?" Devlin asked, settling himself in a nearby chair. "At the moment, I think Bow Street would investigate the Archbishop of Canterbury himself if someone were to suggest it might be relevant to these murders. It seems Lord Jarvis has taken an interest in the case. An intense interest." "Ah. I've just had a rather remarkable conversation with the man myself." "Lord Jarvis?" Sebastian nodded. It seems his son was a passenger on a ship that sailed from India some 5 years ago. A merchantman named the Harmony, captained by Edward Bellamy. Among the other passengers were Sir Humphrey Carmichael and Lord Stanton. "Merciful heavens!" Henry sat up straighter. "I remember the Harmony. It was in all the papers." His lordship hesitated as Mrs. McCoy appeared at the doorway, bearing a serviceable tray piled with a teapot and teacups and a plate of small cake slices. Lord Devlin waited until she had poured the tea and withdrawn. Then he gave a terse recitation of his conversation with Jarvis. "I wasn't in England 5 years ago," he finished, "but you say you recall the incident?" "Oh, yes. It was quite the sensation." Henry set aside his tea untasted and arose to pace thoughtfully up and down the small room. A lurid explanation was taking form in his imagination. He kept trying to push the idea from his mind, but the tie between the murders and the Harmony's harrowing experience raised a grisly possibility he couldn't seem to banish. At last he said, "You know what this suggests, don't you?" He turned to the Viscount. "The butchering of the bodies, the draining of the blood?" His voice trailed away. Devlin met his gaze and held it. "Englishmen have resorted to cannibalism before, when faced with starvation and death." Henry drew a handkerchief from his pocket and coughed into its snowy folds. "I don't believe there was any suggestion that while they were becalmed, the officers and passengers of the Harmony—" "That doesn't mean it didn't happen," said Devlin, when Henry left the rest of his sentence unsaid. "It's an unwritten rule of the sea that prohibition against cannibalism may be suspended in the case of shipwrecked survivors or men becalmed. Think of the Peggy, or the raft of the Medusa. Sometimes the survivors admit to what they've done. At other times there is only a suspicion that lingers over them. Usually they eat the bodies of their companions who are the first to die. Is that not true?" "Usually. But lacking that option, lots can be drawn, and the loser sacrificed for the good of his companions. Only somehow I can't see Sir Humphrey Carmichael or Lord Stanton putting their names in a hat for the chance to become their companion's dinner." "No," agreed Henry. "Which leads to the suspicion that the victim, if there was one, was selected more arbitrarily. We need to know the names of any other passengers aboard the Harmony on that voyage, as well as the owners of the ship and its cargo." "The records of the inquiry should be on file at the Board of Trade," said Henry. Devlin set aside his cup and rose to his feet. "Good. Let me know what you discover." "You forget, my lord. Bow Street has taken over the case." Devlin smiled and turned toward the door, then hesitated. "One more thing. There's a captain in the Horse Guards named Peter Quayle. When he was with my regiment on the continent, he took a fiendish delight in torturing and mutilating prisoners. I know of no link between him and the Harmony, but you might set one of your constables to discovering his whereabouts on the nights of the murders. Good evening, Sir Henry." Henry thought about that morning's terse conversation with the magistrates of Bow Street and sighed. Later that night, Kat sat before the mirror in her dressing-room at the theatre. In the flickering candlelight, her reflection looked pale, strained. The scent of oranges, grease paint, and ale still hung heavy in the air, but the theatre stretched out quiet around her. The farce had long since ended. Aidan O'Connell had not come. With a hand that was not quite steady, she locked away the rest of her costume and stood. 2 more days. She had 2 more days, and she was, if anything, farther from finding a way out of her dilemma than she had been before. That night, Sebastian dreamed of broken bodies and torn flesh, recent images of young men with butchered limbs blending with older memories of endless bloody carnage on the killing fields of Europe. Waking, he reached for Kat, not remembering until his hand slid across the cool, empty sheet beside him that he slept in his own bed, alone. He sat up, his heart pounding uncomfortably, the need to hold her in his arms strong. Slipping from his bed, he went to jerk open the drapes. The waning moon cast grotesque patterns of light and shadow across the street below. It had been his intention to meet Kat at the theatre after her performance, but she'd told him no, she wasn't feeling well. She certainly didn't look well, her cheeks pale, her eyes heavy-lidded, but he knew from the way she failed to meet his searching gaze that she was lying. Another man might have been suspicious, jealous. Sebastian knew only a deep and powerful sense that something was terribly wrong. He was failing her. He knew that. She was in trouble, and for some reason he couldn't understand, she felt unable to confide in him. Or had she tried to turn to him for help, he wondered, only to find him so preoccupied with stopping this killer that she came away thinking he had no time for her. He realized he couldn't even be sure. Which was, he supposed, a damning conclusion. Chapter 33. Thursday, 19th of September, 1811. Sebastian hesitated in the cool morning shadows of the ancient arcade, his gaze on the gentlewoman ladling porridge at a table set at the far end of the courtyard. The poor and hungry of the city pressed past him, their gaunt frames clad in filthy rags, their faces drawn and desperate. The smell of unwashed bodies, disease, and coming death mingled with the dank, earthy scent of the old stones around them. Once, before Henry VIII cast his covetous eyes upon the wealth of the church, this had been the cloisters of a grand convent. Now it was a half-ruin that served as an open-air relief centre, part of a vast yet woefully inadequate network of private charities that struggled to alleviate the worst of the sufferings of London's burgeoning population of poor. A young girl clutching a wailing baby cast Sebastian a curious look, but he kept his attention fixed on the gentlewoman quietly dispensing porridge. Lady Carmichael. A tall, starkly thin woman in her late 40s, she wore a plain black apron tied over a fine walking dress, also of unrelieved black, for she was in deepest mourning. Beneath a simple black hat covering dark hair heavily laced with grey, her face looked nearly as gaunt and drawn as those of the men and women who crowded around her, cracked and chipped bowls clutched eagerly in desperate hands. Sebastian had known other women dedicated to good works. Most were nauseatingly condescending and self-righteously conscious of their ostentatious benevolence. Not Lady Carmichael. She worked with a quiet selflessness that reminded Sebastian of the nuns he'd encountered on the Iberian Peninsula and in Italy. She was as generous with her smiling words of encouragement as with her porridge. Yet she didn't strike Sebastian as either gentle or soft. There was a firmness there, along with a calm self-possession that marked her as a strong, formidable woman. Sebastian continued to hang back, watching her until the last of the porridge was distributed, and the throng began to thin. Only then did he step forward. "Lady Carmichael." She turned at his words, her gaze assessing him. He had the impression she'd been aware of him, watching her from the shadows. "Yes?" Sebastian touched his fingers to the brim of his hat. "I'm Lord Devlin. I'd like a word with you, if I may." Considering the way Sir Humphrey Carmichael had reacted, Sebastian knew he was taking a chance identifying himself to her. She continued looking at him steadily for a moment, then said, "You wish to talk to me about my son?" It was not a question. "Yes." She drew a deep breath that flared her nostrils, then nodded crisply. "Very well." She motioned to her servant to continue packing up the supplies, then turned to walk with Sebastian beneath the ancient arcade. "Why have you involved yourself in this, my lord? What prompts a wealthy young nobleman to participate in a murder investigation? Morbid curiosity? Arrogance? Or is it simple boredom?" "Actually, it was at the request of a friend." She glanced sideways at him, one eyebrow raised in inquiry. "Sir Henry Lovejoy," he said. "Ah, I see. Yet it's my understanding Bow Street has taken over the investigation. And still you persist? Is that not arrogance?" Sebastian found himself faintly smiling. "I suppose in a sense it is, but that's only part of it." "And what's the other part? Don't tell me it's a desire to see justice done."
There is very little justice in this world, and you know it.
Perhaps. But I can't allow something like this to continue if I can stop it.
Again, that arch of the eyebrow. You think you can stop it?
I can try.
A brief flicker of what might have been amusement softened the grim line of her lips, then faded. And have you discovered anything, my lord?
I think so, yes.
Sebastian studied the gentlewoman's delicately boned profile.
Did you by any chance accompany Sir Humphrey on his trip to India 5 years ago?
India? She swung to face him, the dark skirts of her mourning gown swirling softly around her. Whatever has India to do with my son's death?
Sir Humphrey and Lord Stanton were both returned passengers aboard a ship called the Harmony, captained by Edward Bellamy.
He watched her lips part on a quickly indrawn breath. You think that's the connection between the deaths of Dominic Stanton and my son? The Harmony?
Considering what happened to Adrian Bellamy on Tuesday night, yes.
She brought up one hand to press her fingers to her lips. You mean the young naval lieutenant killed on the docks? That was Captain Bellamy's son?
Yes.
But his body wasn't.
Her voice trailed off. No. But there is evidence his death is connected, nevertheless. Were you a passenger on that ship?
She shook her head. No. I do sometimes travel with my husband, but not on that trip, thankfully. She turned to continue walking, the soft soles of her shoes whispering over the worn stones. You've heard what happened to them?
Yes.
Sir Humphrey was ill for months after his return. I sometimes think he's never entirely recovered from the ordeal.
Do you know who else was on that ship, besides your husband and Lord Stanton?
She hesitated, the frown lines between her eyebrows deepening with thought. Then she shook her head. No, there were some 6 or 7 others, but I don't recall their names.
Was one of them a clergyman?
Actually, yes. A missionary and his wife returning from some years' stay in India. I remember, because he annoyed Sir Humphrey excessively. Her gaze flickered over to Sebastian. Why?
There was a young man murdered down in Kent last Easter, in Avery, the son of one Reverend William Thornton.
And this Reverend Thornton was on the Harmony as well?
I don't know for certain yet, but I suspect so, yes. I do know that he and his wife spent some years on a mission in India.
They walked along in silence for a time, their footsteps echoing in the stone-vaulted corridor. At last she said, It makes no sense. Why would someone be killing the children of the Harmony's passengers?
Someone who wanted revenge, perhaps.
Revenge for what? Sebastian met her gaze and held it, and the air between them crackled with all that remained unsaid. The desperate, starving men and women of the Harmony might have kept their secret for 5 long years, but there was no escaping the implications suggested by the butchered bodies of their children. Lady Carmichael's eyes widened. She shook her head fiercely, her throat working hard as if she were forced to swallow a rise of bile. No! You're wrong. Nothing like that happened on that ship.
Can you be certain?
Her voice throbbed with emotion. My husband is a hard man, Lord Devlin. A hard, brilliant man who can be brutal in business if he must. But only in business. He could never, ever have done what you are suggesting. Never. Sebastian stared off across the now silent, half-ruined cloister, all that remained of what had once been a thriving community.
Most of us probably think we could never do such a thing, he said. Yet, when faced with the stark choice between that and death, I suspect we'd all be uncomfortably surprised by how few would choose death.
You're wrong, she said again, but she was no longer looking at him, and Sebastian suspected she spoke the words in a futile effort to convince herself.
Chapter 34. Kat was seated at the elegant little writing table in her morning room, attempting to draft a terse note to the Irishman, Aidan O'Connell, when she heard Devlin's rich voice in the hall below, mingling with the desultory tones of her maid, Elspeth. Quickly shoving the note out of sight, Kat stood and turned just as he entered the room. He was dressed in doeskin riding breeches and top boots, and brought with him the crisp scent of the September morning. He caught her to him for a quick kiss and said, "Come, ride with me in the park." She held him just an instant too long, then laughed. "I'm not dressed for riding." "So change." He touched his fingers to her cheek, his expression suddenly unexpectedly serious. "I've hardly seen you in the last few days, and when I do, I find you looking tense." The urge to confide the truth to him welled up within her, hot and desperate. Yet even more than she feared Jarvis, she found she feared watching the love in Devlin's eyes turn to hate. And so she kept silent, although the need to confide in him remained, filling her with a bittersweet ache. She brushed her lips across his, and somehow managed to summon up a smile. "Give me 15 minutes. 15 minutes? He said, with exaggerated incredulity, then threw up his hands to catch her playful punch. Some half an hour later, as they trotted side by side through the streets of the city, he told her of Captain Bellamy, his beautiful young Brazilian wife, and little Francesca. Kat knew a pang of fear when he told her of the knife-wielding assassin on the Thames. And then he told her of last night's meeting with Charles, Lord Jarvis. She listened to him in silence. "And you believed him?" she asked, when Devlin had finished. He glanced over her, a light frown touching his forehead. "Sir Henry is checking into the particulars of the ship. But yes, I believe him. It simply fits too well. I suppose even Jarvis must tell the truth at times." She made an inelegant sound deep in her throat. "Without an ulterior motive? Never." She was uncomfortably aware of him watching her as they turned through the gates of the park and rode in silence for a moment. She could fool all of London from the stage, but she couldn't fool this man. He said, "Why won't you tell me what's wrong?" She considered trying to laugh the question away, but knew she would never convince him. Forcing herself to meet his fierce yellow stare, she said in a low, strained voice, "I'm sorry. I can't speak of it." He continued to hold her gaze, his face drawn with worry. But he said no more. She looked away, her attention caught by a small man in a round hat and spectacles hurrying toward them across the park. As she watched, he raised one hand in a discreet attempt to catch their attention. Devlin reined in and swung to his feet. "My lord," said Sir Henry Lovejoy, coming up to them. Pivoting, he gave Kat an awkward little bow. "Miss Boleyn, my apologies for the interruption. Your young tiger told me I might find you here, and I thought you would be interested to hear that I've been to the Board of Trade." "And," said Devlin, "their records of the inquiry into the Harmony's loss appear to be missing. The clerk assures me they've simply been misfiled, and he has instituted a thorough search for them. But it's curious, very curious." Kat heard Devlin utter a soft oath. "You think someone could have taken the records?" she asked. "Surely not," said Sir Henry. Reaching into his coat, the magistrate drew forth a slip of paper. "I was, however, able to ascertain the names of the owners of both the ship and the cargo." "What was she carrying?" asked Devlin, taking the paper. "Tea. In an effort to stave off the mutiny, Captain Bellamy was forced to allow the crew to throw the entire shipment overboard in an attempt to delay the ship's sinking. The owner of the cargo, a Mr. Wesley Oldfield, was ruined. Utterly ruined. He's in debtor's prison at the Marshalsea." "That's interesting." Devlin glanced down at the paper in his hand and gave a wry smile. "What is it?" said Kat, watching him. Devlin handed her the paper. "The ship's owner. It's Russell Yates." Sir Henry cleared his throat. "You know Mr. Yates?" "Mr. Yates is a well-known figure around the West End," said Kat. "The man used to be a pirate." "A pirate?" She smiled. "Well, a privateer. He was the younger son of an East Anglian nobleman, but ran off to sea as a boy and came home a wealthy man. He still wears a gold hoop in one ear and talks like a pirate. Society professes to be scandalized, but they tolerate him because he's Yates and he was brought up a gentleman, and he is both amusing and very, very wealthy." Sir Henry was looking serious. "You think he could have something to do with these savage murders?" "Yates?" Kat thought about it. "I suspect he could be savage if driven to it. But to coldly murder 4 young men for something their fathers might have done? No, I don't think he could do that." "What finally happened to the Harmony?" Devlin asked. "Do you know?" Sir Henry nodded. "According to what I've been able to discover, a partial crew from HMS Sovereign tried to patch her up and sail her back to London, but she was too far gone. They finally had to abandon her when she foundered in heavy seas off Lisbon." "So Mr. Yates suffered a loss as well?" "So it would seem, although the ship might well have been insured. I plan to spend the afternoon in the offices of the city newspapers reading their back issues for more details on the incident." "I thought you were off the case," said Devlin with a smile. A rare gleam of amusement lit the magistrate's serious grey eyes. "I am." Chapter 35. Having exchanged the Black Arab for his curricle, Sebastian rattled across the worn stones of London Bridge into Southwark. The sun shone warm and golden on the river, but the lanes around the Marshalsea prison were dark and dank, the air heavy with the foul stench of rubbish and rot and despair. "Wesley Oldfield," said Devlin, pressing a coin into the shaky hand of an old man he came across within the prison's high grey brick walls. "Where might I find him?" "Up the stairs, last door to your right," said the man in a surprisingly cultured voice. "Thank you." Holding a handkerchief to his nose, Sebastian climbed the noisome, urine-stained stairs and made his way down a cold passage. The sound of a violin playing a sad, sweetly lilting tune came to him from the far side of the scarred old door at the end of the corridor. The music stopped when Sebastian knocked. "Who is it?" called a tight, anxious voice. "Viscount Devlin." The door jerked open. An unkempt man stood on the far side. According to what Sebastian had been able to learn, Wesley Oldfield was in his late 30s. But the man before Sebastian looked a good 20 years older than that, his long, matted hair the colour of a winter sky, his face sunken and grey with ill health. He stood hunched over, one hand on the edge of the door as if for support, the other arm cradling a battered violin. He appeared at Sebastian through watery, washed-out blue eyes, his jaw slack. "Do I know you?" "Mr. Wesley Oldfield," said Sebastian. The man ran one hand across the stubble on his chin in a self-conscious gesture. "That's right. May I come in?" Oldfield hesitated, then took a step back, and swept a flourishing bow. "Come in, do come in. Pray accept my apologies for the less than salubrious nature of my accommodations." Sebastian stepped into a small, low-ceilinged room with a meagre, empty fireplace and a single barred window. The room was as unkempt as the man, and smelled foully of stale sweat and excrement, and the slowly creeping madness that can come from a once promising life, now hopelessly derailed. Oldfield moved awkwardly to clear the clutter of papers and books from the threadbare seat of a once grand chair. "Please, sit down. I get so few visitors these days, I fear I'm forgetting my manners. May I offer you brandy?" He reached for a bottle that stood open on a rickety table, then said, "Oh dear," and tusked softly to himself, staring down at the empty bottle. "I must have finished it last night. I have no need of refreshment, thank you." Looking at the broken man before him, Sebastian found it difficult to believe Oldfield could have had anything to do with the murders. He wasn't sure the man was even capable of remembering anything of significance about the Harmony or its last fatal voyage. "You're the Earl of Hendon's son, are you not?" said Oldfield, turning away to lay the violin in its case with an almost reverent air. "You know my father?" "I know of him." The man swung back to fix Sebastian with an unexpectedly steady stare. "Why are you here?" "I wanted to talk to you about the Harmony." The man's reaction to this bald statement was utterly unexpected. The Harmony might have led to his ruin, but at the mention of the ship's name he came to perch on the edge of his unmade bed, a strange excitement animating his features as he leaned forward. "You've noticed it too, have you?" "Noticed what?" "These killings. First the Reverend Thornton's son." "You know about Nicholas Thornton?" "Oh, yes, I know. First Thornton, then Carmichael and Stanton, and now Bellamy. Someone is killing their sons." Sebastian stared into the man's tortured, mad eyes. "Do you know why?" "Why? Not exactly, no. But when you think about the way those young men were butchered, it gives you some ideas, does it not?" He broke off to cast Sebastian a sideways glance. "Is that why you're here? Do you think I'm responsible?" "You're in prison," said Sebastian. An eerie smile played around the other man's lips. "Yes, but we're sometimes allowed out, you know." "Only during the day," noted Sebastian. "Carmichael, Stanton, and Bellamy were all killed at night, when you're locked in." Oldfield's smile slipped. "True." Then he brightened. "I could have hired someone." "You're bankrupt." "There is that," Oldfield sighed. "And I've no motive." Sebastian glanced around the cold prison cell. "No?" Oldfield tusked again and shook his head. "It was the crew who insisted my cargo be thrown overboard. They thought the ship was going to sink." Sebastian started to remind him that the ship actually had sunk in the end. Then he changed his mind. "It's the crew who ruined me," Oldfield was saying. His nostrils quivered, his hatred twisting his lips cruelly with each word. "Dirty, ignorant scum, panicking, abandoning the ship the way they did, taking all the food and water, leaving the others to die. I would gladly butcher every last one of their god-rotted carcasses, but—" He broke off, his voice and features suddenly returning to normal. "They're already dead." "They're dead?" "That's right. Most of them were killed by natives when their boat landed on the west coast of Africa. The few who survived were picked up by His Majesty's Navy and brought back to London to hang." "You attended their trial?" Oldfield cast him a scornful look. "What do you think? Every minute of it. Their trial and their hangings. One of the crewmen, I think his name was Parker, he made a bad end of it, struggling and shouting even after they had the rope around his neck. He kept swearing the men who testified at his trial were lying." Sebastian sat forward. "Lying? About what?" Oldfield shrugged. "I don't recall now. It had nothing to do with me." He scratched thoughtfully at the skin behind one ear. "But I do remember the man had a brother, a docker. He was there at the trial and at the hanging. Swore he'd see that the buggers paid for his brother's death." "See that who paid?" "Why, those who testified at the trial, of course." "And who was that?" Oldfield smiled.
Bellamy, Stanton, Carmichael.
The smile slipped, but not Thornton. He looked confused.
At least, I don't think Thornton was there.
Who else? Asked Sebastian, even as Oldfield turned to glance out the window. The man didn't answer. Sebastian raised his voice and tried again.
Who else was at the trial?
Oldfield swung his head to stare directly at Sebastian. The watery blue eyes widened with confusion.
What trial?
Sebastian found Tom outside the prison, walking the chestnuts up and down the lane.
Learn anything?
Tom asked as Sebastian leapt up to the curricle's seat.
Perhaps.
Perhaps not. I'm afraid Mr. Oldfield's misfortunes have addled his brain. Sebastian took the reins. I want you to find someone for me. A docker by the name of Parker. He had a brother hanged 4 years ago for the mutiny on the Harmony. Tom stepped back from the horses' heads, one hand coming up to hold his hat in place.
You think he might be the cove what's been doing the killing?
He could be. Then again, he could also be a simple figment of Mr. Wesley Oldfield's imagination. Sebastian gathered his reins. He knew a powerful urge to confront both Lord Stanton and Sir Humphrey Carmichael with what he had learned. Yet it would be a mistake, he knew, to approach either man now, before he'd learned the full story of the Harmony's final voyage. It was time, Sebastian realized, for another visit to the Reverend Thornton in Kent. Chapter 36. Returning from her ride with Devlin, Kat tore up her half-written note to the Irishman Aidan O'Connell and burned the scraps. It had occurred to her that sending any written communication, no matter how carefully composed, would be folly. The danger of such a note falling into the hands of Jarvis's agents was simply too high. She had just over 24 hours left. Closing her writing desk with a snap, she went to change into a walking dress of straw-coloured lawn, decorated with plaiting at the bodice and waist, and set out to track down the Irishman herself. The spy-master continued to be elusive, but as she mingled with a crowd of well-dressed onlookers cheering their favourite teams in the summer's last regatta on the Thames, Kat found herself in the company of Russell Yates, ex-privateer and former owner of the ill-fated Harmony. For a woman with Kat's talents, it was easy enough to manoeuvre herself next to Yates and engage him in conversation. He was an imposing figure, tall and large-boned, with broad shoulders and a solid physique he kept well honed at Jackson's and Angelo's. He wore the buff-coloured breeches, striped silk waistcoat, and dark blue morning coat of a gentleman, but he still looked like a pirate, with his hawkish nose, sun-darkened skin, and dark hair he kept just a shade too long.
"I saw you at Covent Garden last night," he said, the gold hoop in his left ear catching the light as he bowed over her hand. "I must say you make a charming shrew, but then you also make a regal Cleopatra and an incomparable Juliet."
Kat smiled.
"We're considering doing Othello next. I thought of you when I read the text. You owned a ship that was lost at sea, did you not? The Helpmate, or the Handsome, or some such thing?"
He lifted a glass of wine from the tray of a servant who hovered at his elbow and took a slow sip.
"The Harmony, singularly inappropriately christened ship, considering its fate."
"You've heard the rumours, I suppose, that these grisly murders are somehow linked to the ship's ordeal?"
"No, I hadn't heard any talk, but I'm not surprised. Devilish business, that. Frankly, I'm glad the ship sank off Portugal. It would have been impossible to crew with that kind of history. And then, what would I have done with it?"
A cool breeze from the river flapped Kat's straw hat. She put up one hand to steady it. "The ship was insured, was it?"
Yates laughed. "Oh, yes, I believe in insurance.
Unlike Wesley Oldfield, poor sod.
Oldfield?
The Harmony carried a shipment of his tea. Lost it all. Third cargo in as many months. Turned his brain, I'm afraid. That and the accommodations in the Marshalsea, I suppose. A shout went up from among the crowd of spectators. Cat swung to look out over the water to where the lead crew was fighting hard to maintain their advantage, the spray from their oars sparkling in the sunshine.
Was Oldfield a passenger on the Harmony?
Oldfield? No.
She glanced back at the man beside her.
Were you?
A slow smile spread across his pirate face.
You know, I'm getting the distinct impression you engaged me in conversation this afternoon for the sole purpose of learning everything you could about the Harmony.
Acute of you, said Cat, returning his smile.
He laughed, then abruptly sobered. It's because of Devlin, I suppose. I've heard he's looking into these murders. I must admit, I didn't think about the possible connection to the Harmony when it was just Carmichael and Stanton. But now that they've found Captain Bellamy's son dead as well...
Cat studied his handsome, sun-darkened face. Do you have sons, Mr. Yates?
No, thank God, considering the circumstances.
He brought one hand to his chest and gave an exaggerated sigh.
I've never yet found a woman to steal my heart.
She laughed politely, as she was meant to do, then said, Who else died on that ship besides Lord Jarvis's son David?
Let me see.
Yates dropped his hand to his side and stared thoughtfully out over the river.
2 or 3 of the crew were killed in the storm, I believe. The rest either died under some African spear or at the end of a rope. But that's it. The ship's log was lost in the wreckage, so there's no real record.
None of the other passengers died?
He shook his head. There were only some 6 besides Stanton and Carmichael. And no, I don't recall their names, he added, when she opened her mouth to ask exactly that. You know, if you ever tire of the stage, you ought to consider applying at Bow Street. You're a natural.
It's my understanding they don't employ females.
More fool they. I've heard Aidan O'Connell say no one can ferret out information faster or more reliably than a female. I'm beginning to think he's right.
Cat brought her wandering attention back to his face. It seemed a strange thing for him to have said, and she wasn't convinced it was as offhand as it sounded.
You're acquainted with Aidan O'Connell?
A light gleamed in his eyes, then was gone in an instant.
We've been known to do business together.
Cat kept her voice casual and disinterested. Has he left town? I haven't seen him for a few days.
Not that I'm aware of. Do you intend to hound him about the Harmony as well? If I see him, I'll warn him you were asking after him.
Cat gave a soft laugh. What has Aidan O'Connell to do with the Harmony?
Nothing that I know of.
She stayed talking nonsense with him a few more minutes, then moved on. It was some quarter of an hour later, as she was preparing to leave the terrace, that Yates approached her again.
It's occurred to me that there was indeed another death on the Harmony, he said, leaning in close so that his words wouldn't be overheard. Bellamy's cabin boy. A spar fell on him during the storm, injuring him badly. He died several days before the Sovereign's appearance.
The cabin boy? What was his name? Cat asked, her voice coming out more sharp than she'd intended it to.
That I can't recall, but if it comes to mind, I'll be sure to let you know.
Cat had almost reached the steps of her house in Harwich Street when she became aware of a tall, well-dressed gentleman walking toward her, his boot heels tapping ominously on the empty paving.
"Miss Berlin," said Colonel Bryce Epsom-Smith, sweeping her a mocking bow. "How fortuitous. Kat's grip on the handle of her sunshade tightened, then relaxed. Inclining her head, she gave the man a faint, bored smile. "Colonel?" "A gentle reminder about tomorrow night," he told her, his gaze travelling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "After the play, of course. We wouldn't want to deprive London of one last glimpse of the divine Miss Cat Boleyn, in the event that you should elect to be, shall we say, stubborn." Chapter 37. It was mid-afternoon by the time Sebastian drove into the village of Avery in Kent. Having left Tom searching the docks of London for a man named Parker, Sebastian was forced to consign the chestnuts into the care of a lad at the livery stable and walk across the green to the rectory. In the gentle sunshine, the red brick walls of the rectory seemed more sombre than ever, the heavy drapes closed tight at the windows. Sebastian plied the door's brass knocker, then listened to the summons echo into stillness in the depths of the house. He was about to knock again when he heard quick footsteps in the hall. The door was yanked open by the housekeeper, Mrs. Ross, who blanched at the sight of him and put up a hand to straighten her crooked cap. "My lord," she said with a gasp, "I do beg your pardon for leaving you standing here. I thought the housemaid Bess would get the door, but I suspect she's not back yet from the apothecary's. We've been at 6s and 7s here ever since the Reverend took his turn for the worse." "Reverend Thornton is ill?" said Sebastian, unravelling this. Mrs. Ross nodded her head vigorously. "He had a bad turn just after you left. And look at me, leaving you standing on the doorstep." She opened the door wider and stepped back. "Please, do come in, my lord." "May I see him?" Sebastian asked, stepping into the shadowy hall. "If you wish, my lord, but I don't think he'll recognise you. He doesn't even seem to know Dr. Newman, and they've been friends these 20 years or more." She led the way up the stairs to a darkened bedroom lit only by a solitary lamp turned down low. The figure in the vast tester bed seemed shrunken, the wispy grey hair on his scalp damp with sweat, his eyes open but staring blankly. "Reverend Thornton?" said Sebastian. No answering gleam of recognition lit the man's half-open eyes. As Sebastian watched, a pool of spittle spilled over the edge of the clergyman's mouth to dribble down his chin. He made no movement to wipe it away. "It's terrible to see him like this," said Mrs. Ross. "Such a brilliant man he was, so good and God-fearing." The front door knocker sounded again, and she jerked away with a quick apology. Left alone, Sebastian stepped closer to the bed's edge. The rector continued to stare dumbly into space. "What happened on that ship?" said Sebastian softly. My friend?" "It was something terrible, was it not?" "Did you try to stop it, I wonder? Good, God-fearing man that you are? Or were you a willing participant?" He became aware of voices on the stairs. Mrs. Ross's high-pitched, anxious notes answered by Aaron Newman's soothing words. A moment later, the physician entered the room alone. "Any glimmer of recognition?" he asked Sebastian. Sebastian shook his head. "How long has he been like this?" "Since shortly after you left." The doctor came to stand beside his patient. Drawing a handkerchief from his own pocket, he gently wiped the spittle from his old friend's chin. "Mrs. Ross found him collapsed on his study floor. Has he said anything?" "No, nothing." The doctor glanced up. "I'm sorry if you were hoping to ask him any more questions." Sebastian let his gaze drift around the room. It was an old-fashioned chamber with solid oak furniture and a couple of gently worn tapestry-covered chairs drawn up to the empty fireplace. Beside one of the chairs sat a woman's sewing basket and embroidery frame, as if their owner had only just put them down. "Has he ever spoken to you of what happened aboard the Harmony?" Sebastian asked, bringing his gaze back to the physician's face. "You mean on his voyage home from India?" The doctor drew a straight-backed chair closer to the bed and sat. "Very little." "Why?" "I think the events on the ship are linked in some way to the deaths of Nicholas Thornton and the others. Sir Humphrey Carmichael and Lord Stanton were also passengers on that voyage." "Good God!" Then the inevitable conclusion must have occurred to him, because the doctor's eyes opened wide. "Surely you're not suggesting that—" He broke off, unable to put the thought into words. "We have no way of knowing," said Sebastian, "but what was done to the victims' bodies does seem to suggest that the killer, at least, has reason to believe that the survivors of the Harmony resorted to cannibalism to stay alive." The doctor's gaze fell to the shrunken, vacantly staring man in the bed. "No, I can't believe it. I can't believe he'd do such a thing. You didn't know him? How could a man who dedicated his life to God, who could quote Cicero and Seneca at length, who was working on a new translation of the Confessions of St. Augustine, how could that man do something that violates one of the most basic tenets of our civilization?" "Some men will do anything to stay alive." "Not this one," said the doctor, one fist closing tightly around his old friend's slack hand. "I don't believe it." "Did he ever happen to mention the names of any of his shipmates, besides Carmichael and Stanton?" Newman pursed his lips. "I believe there was another man and his wife. I seem to recall Mary Thornton mentioning them once or twice. A couple from somewhere up north." He paused, thoughtful. "There was a spinster of a certain age, and a younger gentleman who was with the East India Company. There may have been others, but I'm sorry I couldn't put a name to any of them." "It's a start," said Sebastian, turning toward the door. The doctor stayed where he was, his gaze on the silent man in the bed. "If it's true," said Newman, after a moment, "if the Reverend did do what you're suggesting, he would see it as his fault, what happened to Nicholas. How could any father live with that kind of guilt?" "Obviously he could not," said Sebastian, and left the doctor there at the bedside of his dying friend. Chapter 38. "Take extra special care of them," Sebastian said, when he turned the tired chestnuts over to Tom several hours later. "The lad at the livery stable down in Avery was a ham-fisted idiot. Don't let me go near that place without you again." Tom grinned and took the reins. "I'll baby 'em for sure." "Any luck with Parker?" "Aye. His name's Matt Parker. He works at the East India Company docks. Spends his evenings at a local called the Hare and Hound on the Ratcliffe Highway." Sebastian regarded his tiger with awe. "However did you find that out?" Tom's grin widened. "You don't want to know." "Perhaps you're right." Sebastian turned toward the garden gate, but paused to say, "Now, if you could just find me a valet." Tom laughed. "I'm working on it, Governor. I'm working on it." The Hare and Hound was a nondescript ramshackle pub reached through a narrow passage between an apothecary and a chandler's. Sebastian pushed his way through a noisy crowd to the bar. He'd taken care to dress for the occasion in a shabby genteel coat, hat and breeches that formed part of his collection from Rosemary Lane. And still he was conscious of curious, vaguely hostile eyes upon him as he ordered a pint. Strangers were never welcome in such establishments. Sipping his ale in thoughtful silence, Sebastian let his gaze drift around the dim room. The Hare and Hound appeared popular with men from the docks, sailors in blue flannel shirts and dockers in rough smocks. Sebastian was starting on his second tankard of ale when a group of dockers came in, big men with broad shoulders and beefy arms. Sebastian listened to their good-natured banter and soon picked out a sandy-haired giant with a badly scarred cheek the other men addressed as Parker. Sebastian returned his attention to his ale. The dockers played a game of darts, which Parker won. Sebastian ordered another pint, then looked around to find Matt Parker beside him.
"You watching me for some reason?"
Parker demanded, his light brown eyes narrowed with hostility.
"Actually, yes,"
Sebastian signalled for another pint.
"I'd like to talk to you about your brother."
"Jack?" Parker's eyebrows drew together in a suspicious frown.
"Yes. And who the devil might you be?"
"My name is Devlin," said Sebastian, making no attempt to disguise the crisp upper-crust tones of his speech. Parker made a rude noise.
"You sound like a bloody knob. What would a knob want with the likes of gallows bait like Jack?"
Sebastian considered offering the man money, then decided against it. There was a proud edge to the docker's bearing that told Sebastian the gesture would not be well received. "I understand your brother went to his death insisting the men who testified at his trial lied," said Sebastian.
"So? That was over 4 years ago now. No one ever paid it no heed before."
The barmaid plunked a frothing tankard of ale on the planks beside them. Sebastian pushed the tankard toward Parker.
"That was before."
The docker left the ale untouched.
"It's because of these murders, ain't it? First Carmichael, then Stanton, now Bellamy."
"You're forgetting Nicholas Thornton."
"Thornton?"
A flicker of confusion showed in the other man's eyes.
"Last Easter, down in Kent." "I didn't hear about him. Don't remember no Thornton at the trial, either."
Parker's tongue flicked out to moisten his lips. Absently reaching for the tankard, he brought the ale to his mouth and drank deeply.
"You're Bow Street, ain't ya?"
he said, setting the tankard down with a snap. There was dawning comprehension and fear in his eyes now, the fear of a man whose words have come back to haunt him.
"You're here because of them things I said at the hanging, about revenge and all. It was all just talk. You hear? Wild talk. Jack was my little brother. He didn't do nothing wrong. The mutiny weren't his idea. He didn't even take part in it. The other sailors, they give him a choice, come with them or stay and die. Who wouldn't go? Is that any reason to hang a man?"
Parker paused, his face slack with grief.
"He was just 17 years old, you know. 17.
"No, I didn't know." Sebastian leaned forward. "Your brother maintained until the end that the men who testified at the trial lied."
"What about?"
Matt Parker drained his tankard, but shook his head when Sebastian moved to order another.
"That David Jarvis, him whose father is cousin to the king. They said the lad was hurt in the mutiny. Said one of the crew members stabbed him in the side with a cutlass."
Parker shook his head.
"It weren't so. That young knob was just fine when the crew left the ship."
Parker dropped his voice and leaned in close.
"Something happened on that ship when they was adrift. You think on what's been done to these murdered young gentlemen's bodies, and you'll know what I'm talking about."
Straightening, he was silent for a moment, his head turned as if he stared at something in the distance. Then his jaw hardened, and he brought his gaze back to Sebastian's face.
"You're right about one thing. I did swear to see all them title buggers pay for what they done to Jack. But I'm a God-fearing man, and somehow I couldn't bring myself to do it. I figure the good Lord'll take care of 'em in his own way."
A quiver of distaste passed over the docker's scarred features.
"Whoever's doing this, whoever is butchering those men's children, I'd say he's got a father's anger in him, and a father's hurt.
Parker put his wrists together and held them out like a man surrendering to the law.
You can arrest me right now and take me in, but the killing won't stop. Whoever's doing this, he's damned himself to hell, and he knows it. He won't stop until he's killed them all.
How many others were there?
I don't know,
said Parker, his face unexpectedly pale.
Only Stanton, Carmichael and Bellamy testified at the trial. But there were others, passengers and officers both. And God help their children.
So now you know, said Kat softly, as they lay talking in each other's arms later that night. You wondered what kind of secret could be so terrible that men would willingly put their own children at risk rather than reveal it. If what Matt Parker says is true, the survivors of the Harmony didn't just commit cannibalism. They also caused the death of Jarvis's only son. Sebastian entwined his hand with hers and brought it to his lips. They'd made love slowly and sweetly, and still the feeling he'd had for days persisted, that gnawing certainty that something was terribly wrong. He just didn't know what. And he knew the fear of all lovers that he could lose her. Again. "What are you going to do?" she asked, and it took him a moment to realize she was talking about the investigation. He shifted his weight.
"I think I'm going to pay another call on Captain Edward Bellamy."
"Do you honestly think he'll tell you what happened?"
"No, but he sure as hell can't have forgotten the name of his own cabin boy. If what Yates told you is right."
"You think the killer is the boy's father?" Sebastian ran a hand down her naked side in a gentle caress.
"Either him or Jarvis."
Kat was silent for a moment. Then she said in an odd, tight voice, "I can imagine Jarvis ordering those young men killed and mutilated." Sebastian lifted his head to look at her. Even in the soft light of the flickering candles she seemed pale and drawn. Yet he could find nothing to say or do to successfully encourage her to confide in him.
"Yes, except it doesn't fit somehow. How could Jarvis have found out what happened on that ship? And why not move against the men directly? God knows he's powerful enough."
"Jarvis has spies all over the country," Kat countered, sitting up. "How could the simple father of some dead cabin boy have found out what happened on that ship?" Sebastian sighed and drew her back down to him.
"I don't know. Perhaps when we find out who he was, we'll have the answer."
Chapter 39. Friday, the 20th of September, 1811. The next day Sebastian was reading the Morning Post while consuming a light breakfast in his morning room when he suddenly let out a crude oath.
"Is something wrong with the eggs, my lord?" asked his major-domo, starting forward.
"What?" Sebastian looked up, puzzled.
"Oh, no. The eggs are fine, Maury. Thank you."
Shoving the plate aside, Sebastian turned his attention to the news article on page 3. "Retired Greenwich sea captain found dead in river." The church bells were tolling a death knell when Sebastian drove into the outskirts of Greenwich. Leaving the chestnuts in Tom's care, Sebastian let himself in the garden gate at the end of the long walk. He glanced up at the spreading limbs of the old oak, but the child Francesca was not there today. With an oddly troubled heart, he mounted the steps to the house. He half expected the captain's young widow to decline to see him, but he sent up the name he'd given her before, Mr. Simon Taylor, and after a few moments the little housemaid Gilly returned to tell him Mrs. Bellamy would receive him. She half sat, half lay upon a sofa drawn up so she could look out over the gleaming expanse of the river sliding past the house. At Sebastian's appearance, she tucked the black-edged handkerchief she'd been clutching up her sleeve. The ravages left by her tears were obvious.
"My apologies for intruding upon you at such a time," said Sebastian, bowing over her hand. "Please accept my condolences for your newest loss."
She didn't seem to notice the subtle differences in his appearance and attire. She simply nodded, swallowing as if unable to speak for a moment, then gestured to a nearby chair. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Taylor. What may I do for you?" Sebastian hesitated. According to the article in the Post, Bellamy was believed to have fallen into the water and drowned after suffering some sort of seizure while walking along the river. To Sebastian it seemed improbable. But how do you ask a woman if her husband committed suicide? He said instead,
"What can you tell me about your husband's last voyage on the Harmony?"
The question didn't seem to surprise her. She brought up one fist to press her knuckles against her lips, and Sebastian found himself wondering how much of the truth the captain had confided to his wife. "It preyed upon him always, that voyage," she said in a strained voice. "Not simply the loss of the ship, but the mutiny of the crew, and those long, horrible days without food. He never got over it."
"It ruined his career,"
said Sebastian. "Yes, but I often thought there was more to it than that. Such terrible dreams he would have. He'd wake up screaming as if he'd looked into the very jaws of hell, calling that poor boy's name."
"What boy?"
Sebastian asked sharply. "Gideon, the cabin boy." She hesitated, then shook her head. "If I ever knew his last name, I'd forgotten it. He died, you see, before they were rescued."
"What about the other young man who died?
David Jarvis.
Did your husband ever mention him?"
"Sometimes, but not nearly so often. I believe Gideon reminded my husband of Adrian at that age. I often thought my husband blamed himself for the boy's death."
"Why is that?"
She looked confused. "Because he failed to keep the boy out of harm's way, I suppose." She pleated the skirt of her morning gown with shaking fingers. He'd been particularly obsessed about the cabin boy's death these past few months. She hesitated, then added softly, "He began drinking far more heavily than before."
"Was he drinking heavily last night?"
She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. Sebastian watched her swing her head away to stare out over the river. He supposed it was possible the old captain had staggered into the river and been too drunk to haul himself out. But Sebastian doubted it.
"What will you do now?" he asked her. "Return to Brazil?"
She shook her head. "My father disowned me when I married Bellamy and followed him here to England. Besides, this is the only home Francesca has ever known."
"How is she taking it?"
The widow sighed. "Badly. First Adrian, now her father. It's too much." Rising, Sebastian slipped one of his cards from his pocket and laid it on the table.
"If there is anything I can do, please don't hesitate to contact me."
Of course, the name on the card, his own name and title, did not match the name he had given her, but now was not the time to explain it to her.
"I'll see myself out,"
he said, and left her, still staring silently, out the window. At the gate, he glanced back at the house's crepe-draped facade. He saw a flash at one of the third-story nursery windows, a child's pale face pressed for an instant against the panes. Then it was gone. Chapter 40. Sebastian was in his library, glancing through the credentials of another round of applicants for the position of valet, when Maury knocked discreetly at the door. A young lady to see you, my lord.
Sebastian looked up in surprise.
A young lady? Yes, my lord.
For a lady of quality to visit the home of an unmarried man was considered a serious breach of etiquette. Sebastian pushed to his feet.
Show her in immediately.
A tall young woman wearing a heavy veil swept into the room. She waited until the majordomo had bowed himself out, then thrust back her veil to reveal the no-nonsense features of Miss Hero Jarvis.
"Good God!"
said Sebastian, before he could stop himself. A breath of amusement flickered across her face.
"Just so,"
she said crisply, jerking off her fine kid gloves. "Believe me, Lord Devlin, I am as appalled to be here as you are to have me. However, when I considered the alternatives, it soon became apparent that this was by far the simplest course. No one who knows either of us will give a moment's serious credence to any rumours that may arise should my visit here become known, which it will not. My maid awaits me in the entrance hall." Sebastian blinked, then stretched out one hand to indicate the nearest sofa.
"Please, have a seat."
"Thank you, but I have no intention of tarrying longer than necessary." Untying the strings of her reticule, she drew forth several sheets of paper, folded and worn as if with repeated readings.
"What is that?"
he asked warily. She held the folded pages out to him. "A letter written by my brother, David, and mailed from Cape Town. The Harmony docked there for minor repairs on the voyage home from India, and David entrusted the letter to an officer on a frigate that sailed before them."
"Look at it,"
she said impatiently, when he hesitated. Taking the letter from her hand, he flipped it open.
"Dearest Hero," he read,
then paused to glance up at her.
"Why are you giving this to me?"
To his surprise, she tweaked the letter from his grasp. "I'm not. I simply thought it best that you actually see it, so that you would have no doubt as to its existence. What I am giving you is this." She drew another paper from her reticule. This time he took it promptly. He found himself staring at a list of names written in a different scrawl he took to be Miss Jarvis's own. He threw her a quizzical look, then glanced quickly through the list. Some of the names, Lord Stanton, Sir Humphrey Carmichael, the Reverend and Mrs. Thornton, he recognized. Others he did not. "My brother was a keen and enthusiastic observer of his fellow men," she was saying. His letter contained delightful vignettes on each and every one of his fellow passengers and the Harmony's officers. That is a listing of their names. Sebastian brought his gaze back to her aquiline face.
"How did you know I wanted this?"
"I am my father's daughter," she said enigmatically. Grunting, he ran through the list again. It was divided into 2 sections labelled passengers and officers. Along with the names of the passengers he already knew were 4 he did not: Elizabeth Ware, Mr. and Mrs. Dunlop, and Felix Atkinson. Elizabeth Ware must have been the spinster of uncertain age, he realized. Mr. and Mrs. Dunlop would be the couple with estates in the north, while Mr. Felix Atkinson surely was the gentleman from the East India Company. Beneath the heading Officers were 3 names: Joseph Canning, Elliot Fairfax, and Francis Hillard. At the very bottom was written Gideon, cabin boy. Sebastian swore softly under his breath. "What is it?" asked Miss Jarvis.
"The cabin boy's last name. You don't know it?"
"No. David referred to him only as Gideon." Her brows drew together in a light frown. "He's important. Why?" Sebastian looked into her haughty, disdainful face and somehow overcame the urge to answer her question. Folding the list, he tucked it into his pocket, then stood regarding her quizzically.
"I still don't understand why you brought the list directly to me, rather than simply giving it to your father."
To his surprise, she looked vaguely discomfited. Twitching the skirt of her dusky blue walking dress with one hand, she said airily, "It so happens that my father is unaware of the letter's existence. It would serve no purpose for him to learn of it now. I trust you will not mention it to him?" Sebastian leaned back against his desk and folded his arms at his chest, his gaze on Miss Jarvis's face. As he watched, an unexpected tide of colour touched her cheeks, and he found himself wondering what else David Jarvis had written in that letter to his sister that she was unwilling to allow either Sebastian or her own father to read its contents. As if aware of his train of thought, she said, "My brother was a very sensitive young man. He knew our father found him disappointing. I don't believe I need to say more." Her words awakened uncomfortable memories from Sebastian's own youth, memories of Hendon's palpable disappointment in his heir during the long, painful years following the deaths of Cecil and Richard. "No," said Sebastian, pushing away from the desk, "you've no need to say more. And I won't mention the letter to his lordship. Now, don't you think it's time you collected your maid and ran away?" Lowering her veil, she turned to go, then hesitated to say, "I know my father believes me to be in danger." "You disagree?" said Sebastian, surprised. "If my reading of this situation is correct, yes." "Then why are you here?" "I looked into some of the names on that list. Mr. Felix Atkinson has 2 children, a son named Anthony and a younger daughter. Mr. and Mrs. Dunlop have 3 children. They're why I am here, and why I hope you will do all within your power to catch this madman, whoever he is, before he strikes again." Chapter 41. Sir Humphrey Carmichael was seated at his elegant desk at the bank, his head bent over some ledgers, when Sebastian walked in and slapped a sheet of paper on the blotter before him. "What the hell is this?" Carmichael demanded, looking up. Sebastian went to stand with his back to the window overlooking the street. "It's a list of the passengers and officers of the Harmony. You do see the pattern, I presume?" A muscle jumped along Carmichael's jaw, but he said nothing. Sebastian leaned against the edge of the windowsill and crossed his arms at his chest. "You didn't tell me you and Lord Stanton were once shipmates." Carmichael settled back in his chair, his lower lip curling in disdain. "What do you think? That I discuss the details of my private life with anyone who should happen to express an interest in them? I think that for once in your life you've found yourself in a situation you can't control." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you? Did you hear that Captain Bellamy is dead?" "I had heard." "The tale is he fell in the river. I suppose it's even possible, given the way he's been drinking lately. But I suspect suicide is the more likely explanation. It must be a difficult thing to live with, knowing your actions in the past have led directly to the death of your only son." "Get out," said Carmichael, his voice shaking with raw anger. "Get out of my office." Sebastian stayed where he was, his gaze on the other man's livid face. "What really happened on that ship?" "It's no mystery. The story was in all the papers." "Your version of the story?" "There is no other." "Really?" "That's not what Jack Parker's brother says. You do remember Jack Parker, don't you? Your testimony helped to hang him. Except it seems that according to Jack Parker, Lord Jarvis's son David wasn't hurt in the mutiny after all. David Jarvis was alive and well when the crew left the ship." Carmichael shoved to his feet. "They left us to starve. How can you believe anything one of those blackguards said? Men with a rope around their necks don't usually lie." Carmichael calmly resumed his seat and pulled the ledger toward him. "I'm a busy man, my lord. Kindly close the door on your way out." Sebastian pushed away from the windowsill, but he paused at the door to look back and say, "By the way, you wouldn't happen to remember the name of the Harmony's cabin boy, would you?" Carmichael's head came up, all colour slowly draining from his face. He sucked in a deep breath, but all he said was, "No, I wouldn't." Sebastian was leaving the bank, headed up Threadneedle Street, when he heard his father's deep baritone call peremptorily, "Devlin!" Sebastian looked around as the Earl's ponderous town carriage drew up, its crested doors swinging open. "Step up," said Hendon. "I'd like a word with you." As if sensing Sebastian's hesitation, Hendon growled, "This isn't about your bloody Aunt Henrietta and her matrimonial machinations. Now step up, will you?" Sebastian laughed and leapt up beside his father. "Why didn't you tell me someone tried to kill you on the Thames the other day?" Hendon demanded without preamble. "How did you hear about that?" Hendon pressed his lips together in a tight frown. "It's because of what you were asking about the other day. These murders, isn't it?" "Yes." Hendon's chest swelled. "Damn it, Devlin! What kind of pastime is this for a man of your birth and station? Mixing with the lowest dregs of society? Nosing around for information like some common village constable?" Sebastian kept his own voice steady. "We've been through all this before, sir." Hendon worked his lower jaw back and forth in thought. "You're bored. Is that it?" "Not exactly." "Because if it is, there's no denying the Foreign Office could use a man with your talents. I don't need to elaborate. I know what you did in the army." He paused. When Sebastian said nothing, he added gruffly, "We are still at war, remember?" "I remember." "Napoleon has a new spy master in London, replacing Pierpont. Did you know that?" "I had assumed he would." Hendon sat forward. "Yes, but whereas we knew of Pierpont and could keep an eye on those he contacted, this man's identity continues to elude us." Sebastian stared out the window at a ragged boy sweeping manure from the crossing. His next step, Sebastian had decided, would be to pay a visit to Lord Stanton. "Devlin, did you hear what I said? Even if Jarvis is able to persuade this actress to betray Napoleon's man, your contribution to—" "What?" Sebastian brought his gaze back to his father's face. "What actress?" "I don't know her name. I gather she was passing information to Pierpont before he fled the country last winter. Jarvis has given her until tonight to give up the man's name or suffer the consequences." Sebastian's hand tightened around the swaying carriage strap beside him. He was only dimly aware of his father's voice continuing. A succession of images from last February flickered through Sebastian's memory. Cat, holding out a red leather book she'd somehow known to retrieve from its hiding place. Cat, dressed in black, her face pale after Rachel York's funeral. Cat, as she'd been these last few days, nervous and afraid. "Devlin, are you listening to me?" Sebastian sat forward abruptly. "Tell your coachman to draw up." "What? What are you doing?" Hendon demanded as Sebastian thrust open the carriage door. "Devlin!" Chapter 42. Charles, Lord Jarvis, leaned forward to study the row of hieroglyphs emblazoned against the brilliantly painted red and green tones of the sarcophagus. "Late 7th or 6th century BC, wouldn't you say?" He turned to the curator at his elbow, a painfully thin man whose shrunken skin and bony features reminded Jarvis of the Egyptian mummies the scholar had dedicated his life to studying. "I'd say so, yes," agreed the curator, clearing his throat. The sarcophagus was part of a shipment of Egyptian artifacts, only recently arrived at the British Museum, and Lord Jarvis was amongst the first in London to see them. His passion for Egyptology was one of the few distractions from statecraft Jarvis allowed himself. He turned to the enigmatic statue of a cat displayed on a nearby plinth.
its eyes, ears, and collar picked out in gold.
Ah, lovely. Just lovely.
The sound of footsteps echoing through the empty corridors brought the curator's head around, his features twisted by a look of annoyance mingled with nervousness. When Jarvis requested a private showing, he did not like to be disturbed.
Sir, the museum does not open to the public again till October.
Leave us, said Viscount Devlin, pausing in the doorway to the chamber, his fierce yellow gaze focusing on the curator. The curator opened and closed his mouth several times, then scuttled away. Jarvis uttered a bored sigh.
I trust you have a good reason for this interruption, Lord Devlin.
He was already turning back to the sarcophagus when the Viscount moved, so rapidly as to be but a blur at the periphery of Jarvis's vision. Jarvis was a large man, tall and bulky, with years of comfortable living. Yet by reaching across to grab a handful of Jarvis's waistcoat, Devlin managed to bring him spinning back around. Jarvis saw the flash of a blade, felt cold steel at his throat.
Very well, he said dryly. You have my full attention. Now, what is this about?
I know you threatened Cat Boleyn, said Devlin, his lips peeling back from his teeth as he spit out each word.
And I know why. But if you want the name of Napoleon's new spymaster in London, you're going to have to find another way to get it. If you think, Jarvis began.
Devlin cut him off with a quick jerk of the knife that caused the edge of the blade to nick Jarvis's flesh.
No, the matter is not open for discussion. I'm here to tell you the new situation. All you do is listen.
Jarvis felt rage boil up within him, hot and impotent. He held it in check.
By this time next week, Cat Boleyn will be my wife. You make a move to harm her or threaten her again in any way, and I'll kill you. It's as simple as that. You know I'm a man of my word, and you know I'll do it. I trust I make myself clear.
Jarvis returned the man's hard stare.
Of course, Devlin continued, you could try to have me killed, but I don't think you're that stupid. The consequences for you, if your lackeys were to fail, would be fatal.
With one smooth motion, Devlin withdrew the knife from Jarvis's throat and stepped back. It was with difficulty that Jarvis resisted the urge to bring his hands up to his throat. The Viscount was already crossing the room. Jarvis stopped him before he reached the door.
You would do that. You would marry that traitorous whore.
The Viscount's hand moved. Jarvis felt a passing breath of air, followed by an ugly thwunk, as the blade sank into the wood of the sarcophagus behind him.
Call her that again, said Devlin, and the next knife bites flesh.
Sebastian found her in the shadows near the stage door. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and grease paint. She had the hood of her cloak drawn up as if she were cold. Her pale face and haunted eyes were those of a woman with no hope, no future. He walked up to her and put his hands on her shoulders. What she must have seen in his eyes caused the little colour she had left in her face to drain away.
I know why you've been afraid, he said. It's over now. Jarvis won't bother you again.
He felt her tremble beneath his hands. God save us. Please tell me you didn't kill him.
Not yet. But I think I've convinced him of the folly of threatening my wife.
Your wife?
I found a bishop who's agreed to marry us by special license on Monday evening at 7. I pushed for sooner, but he insists he has other engagements.
You can't marry me.
You've been saying that for months, and I've respected it, but no longer. This is why you refused me before, isn't it? Because of your arrangement with the French.
She drew in a breath that shuddered her chest. Oh, God, partially, but only partially, Devlin. You know what I am, what I have been, an actress, a whore. He pressed his fingers to her lips.
Don't.
Don't say it. She stared up at him. Why not? It's the truth. Would you have me live a lie?
No.
I would have you live a life defined not by what you've been, but by what you are. My past is a part of what I am.
A part,
but only a part. He slid his hands down her shoulders to capture her hands in his. Marry me, Cat. It's the only way I can truly keep you safe. As Cat Boleyn, actress, you will always be vulnerable. As the future Countess of Hendon, no one would dare move against you. Your father will adjust in time. Or not. Her hands twisted beneath his. How can I knowingly cause an estrangement between you? He gave a wry smile. In case you hadn't noticed, there's already an estrangement between us. Society? Society be damned. You think I care what society might think of me? No. I know you do not. But I care. Why? This marriage would ruin you. Losing you would ruin me. I'm not taking no for an answer, Cat, he added quietly, when she only stared at him with wide, bruised-looking eyes. I listened to you before and almost lost you. I can't risk losing you again. You think this marriage will protect me from Jarvis? Yes. Nothing I could do or say would signal to him more clearly my intention to keep you safe. She was silent for so long, he knew a quiet blooming of fear. Then she swallowed hard, her chin jerking up. It's true, you know. I did pass information to the French. For years. Do you still? No. Not since February. Then I don't care. Her mouth parted silently, her forehead knitting with confusion. He knew she couldn't understand him, would never be able to understand how his experiences in the war had affected him in this way. He ran one thumb across the back of her hand. You did it for Ireland, didn't you? Yes. Then how could you think I would hold your love of your country against you? He brought her hands to his lips. I'm frightened by the fact you put yourself at risk. And I'm hurt because you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth, even before the threat from Jarvis. But my love for you is undiminished, Cat. It always will be. A tear escaped from the edge of one eye to roll silently down her cheek. I don't deserve this kind of love, she whispered. This kind of devotion. He gave her a tender, crooked smile. I intend to spend a lifetime convincing you that you do. The notice of our approaching nuptials will be in the morning papers. A shadow crossed her face. Then there's something else you must do tonight.
What is that?
Tell your father. Chapter 43. There was a heavy mist that night that brought with it the crisp scent of outlying newly ploughed fields and the distant briny hint of the North Sea. Finding his father gone from his Grosvenor Square home, Sebastian walked the boisterous length of St. James's, a purposeful and solitary figure. The street rang with the clip-clop of horses' hooves, the laughter of gentlemen lurching along the footpath in evening dress, or calling to one another from passing curricles. He visited first one gentleman's club, then the next, until he came upon the Earl of Hendon in the reading-room of White's, a book open on one knee, a glass of brandy on the table at his elbow. Sebastian paused in the doorway. His father sat with his head bowed, his attention all for the volume before him. Hendon had no patience for the likes of Plato or Plautus, Euripides or Virgil, but he had great respect for the works of the Roman statesmen, from Cicero and Pliny the Elder to Julius Caesar himself, and he often spent his evenings thus, reading.
In the gentle pool of golden light cast by the oil lamp beside him, he looked much like the father of Sebastian's childhood, in the years before his brother's deaths and his mother's disappearance. Remembering those days now, Sebastian felt a pain building in his chest and sought to ease it with a sigh. The relationship between the Earl of Hendon and his last surviving son had never been a comfortable one, but through it all, through the anger and hurt and confusion, Sebastian's love for his father had endured. And so it was with a heavy weight of sorrow and no small measure of apprehension that Sebastian crossed the carpet to his father's side.
"Come, walk with me. There's something we must discuss."
Glancing up, Hendon met his son's eyes for one long moment, then slipped a marker in his book and stood.
"I'll get my cloak and walking stick."
Side by side they walked lamp-lit pavements gleaming with damp, a heavy silence between them. At last Sebastian said,
"I wanted to tell you in person that I've sent a notice to the Morning Post."
Hendon's gaze swivelled toward him, and Sebastian knew by the narrowing of his father's eyes and the sudden slackness of his jaw that Hendon understood what Sebastian was about to say. The Earl's voice was an explosion of sound that startled a dappled grey between the shafts of a passing hackney.
"Good God! Don't tell me you've actually done it."
"Not yet. Monday evening at 7 by special licence. I don't expect your blessing, but I would wish for your acceptance."
"My acceptance?"
Hendon's lips twisted into a snarl.
"Never."
Sebastian set his jaw.
"Nevertheless, it will happen whether you accept it or not. There's nothing you can do to stop it. I swear to God I'll disinherit you. All you'll get from me is what is not within my power to withhold from you. The title and the entailed estates."
"I expected as much."
"Did you, by God?"
Sebastian studied his father's dark, contorted face.
"And would you respect me, I wonder, if I allowed such a consideration to dissuade me?"
Hendon's fist tightened around his walking stick. Then, to Sebastian's surprise, the Earl's jowly features softened for one brief instant. It was as if the fury momentarily ebbed, allowing a glimpse of the hurt and disappointment that fed it.
"Sebastian,"
said his father, disconcerting him, for it was rare that Hendon called him by his given name rather than his title.
"For God's sake, think this through."
"You think I have not? This is what I've wanted for years, as well you know." Hendon's features hardened.
"I'll never regret what I did 7 years ago."
Sebastian met his father's fierce gaze.
"You did what you thought was right. I understand that now. Do you?"
"Yes. But that doesn't mean it was right. You were wrong about Kat, as she showed when she rejected the money you offered her."
"Was I wrong about her? Then why the devil has she agreed to this? Doesn't she understand what this marriage will do to you? For God's sake, Devlin, consider the consequences. You'll be an outcast from everything familiar to you, turned away from your clubs, shunned by your friends. And for what? The love of a woman? Do you think your love's so strong that it can survive the realization that you've allowed it to destroy your life?" "Yes,"
said Sebastian tightly. Hendon made an angry swiping gesture through the air with one gloved hand.
"You think yourself the first man to love a woman who was forbidden him? I know what you're going through, Devlin. You think you'll never get over it, but you will. You will."
Sebastian stared at his father.
"You? What woman did you love?" "Never mind that," said Hendon gruffly, as if he regretted having said so much. "It was long ago."
They were on Grosvenor Street now. Sebastian paused at the base of the steps leading up to Hendon House.
"Obviously not so long ago that you've forgotten it."
Hendon gripped the railing beside him.
"If you insist on going through with this, I swear to God, I'll never darken your doorway again."
Sebastian drew a deep breath that did nothing to ease the ache in his chest.
"At 7 o'clock Monday night, I will make Catbolin my wife. If it causes an estrangement between us, I'm sorry for that. Good night, Father."
Chapter 44. "Oh, Sebastian, I am so sorry," said Cat later that night when he told her of his interview with his father. She lay in his arms, her glorious auburn hair spilling over his naked shoulder and down her back. He tangled his fingers in her hair, smoothing it away from her face.
"It could have been worse."
"Do you think he'll change his mind?"
"No."
She put her hands on his shoulders, rising so that he looked up into her face. And what he saw there, for just an instant, brought a yawning uneasiness to the pit of his stomach. Then her head dipped, her lips parting as she kissed him. "Make love to me," she whispered. He swept his hands down her back, pulling her tight against him.
"Every day, for the rest of my life."
Some time later, he awoke to the sounds of the night, the rumbling of a night soil cart on Harwich Street, the distant cry of the watchman. He lay for a few moments wondering what had awakened him, letting his gaze drift over the curving cheek and gently parted lips of the sleeping woman beside him. Smiling, he was just drifting off to sleep again, when an oddly muffled crack from the back of the house made him open his eyes. The servants had long since retired to their attic bedrooms. There should have been no one downstairs. He sat up, his breath coming hard and quick as he listened to the distant creak of floorboards, the thump of someone bumping into unseen furniture in the dark. Sebastian slid from the bed, his bare feet noiseless as he crept toward the door. Pausing at the fireplace, he selected a heavy poker from the rack of tools. Behind him, Cat stirred, then stilled. Slowly, he opened the door to the hall. The house lay in darkness, the heavy drapes at the windows blocking the faint glow of the waning moon and the street lamps outside. He could hear footsteps now, on the stairs from the ground to the first floor, the scuff of boots, the rubbing of cloth. 2 men, Sebastian decided. Maybe 3. He hadn't expected Jarvis to move so quickly, so directly against them. The poker gripped in both hands like a cricket bat, Sebastian crept to the top of the stairs, then paused. He'd have preferred to fight the intruders on the first floor, farther away from Cat, but he didn't have enough time to make it safely down the stairs and take up a position. And so he waited, and let them come to him. It wasn't until he felt a draught of cool air move across his skin that he realized he was utterly naked. The intruders reached the first-floor hall and turned toward the steps to the second floor, coming into his line of vision. They moved carefully, like men groping blindly in the darkness. But Sebastian had the night vision of a cat. He saw 2 men, one of medium height and build and wearing a slouch hat, the other taller, bulkier. Both carried stout cudgels. It seemed a crude form of attack for a man of Jarvis's ilk. But then Jarvis would want to make the attack look random, the work of housebreakers surprised in the act. They were on the second set of stairs now, the smaller man in the lead, the other some 2 or 3 steps behind him. Sebastian tightened his grip on the poker and waited. He waited until the first man reached the top stair. Lunging out of the shadows, Sebastian swung the poker with full force against the side of the intruder's head. The impact made a sickening, popping sound, iron smashing through flesh and bone. The man himself uttered only a small sigh, his cudgel clattering to the floor as the force of the blow spun him around and sent him toppling backward to thump down one stair after the other. His companion flattened himself against the wall, his eyes wide. For one brief instant, Sebastian looked into the man's white face. Then the man screamed and dropped his club. Whirling, he bolted back down the stairs. Sebastian chased after him, leaping over the bloody, lifeless sprawl of the first housebreaker near the base of the stairs. The second intruder hit the landing on the fly, then shot down the stairs to the ground floor. From overhead came the sound of Kat's voice. "Devlin? Where are you? What is it?" Sebastian kept running. The intruder careened through the dining room, knocking over chairs, crashing into the sideboard. Sebastian reached the dining room doorway just in time to see the man dive through the broken window to the terrace. "Devlin?" "Call for the watch," Sebastian shouted up the stairs. He leapt over an upended chair in his path, then skidded to a halt beside the open window, wary of blundering into an ambush. But he could see the intruder already crossing the garden, running for the back gate. Still carrying the poker, Sebastian stepped gingerly through the broken window and dropped to the terrace. "Watch!" he cried, raising his voice. "Watch, I say!" Pelting across the terrace to the garden, he saw the intruder jerk open the gate and dart through it. Sebastian chased him up the mews, the cobbles smooth and slick beneath his bare feet, the night air cold against his naked skin. The glow of a hastily lit lantern showed from the rooms over the stables. A second light flickered to life across the way. "Watch!" Sebastian cried again, as the man ducked through the arch and swerved left. Still gripping the poker, Sebastian erupted through the arch, then hesitated. The street before him stretched out quiet and empty in the misty lamplight. Pursing his lips, he blew out his breath and said, "Son of a bitch." The shrill of a whistle brought his head around. The bulky figure of the neighbourhood's night watchman blundered around the corner from Harwich Street, his whistle gripped between his teeth, his lantern swinging wildly. "What's this? What's this? What's this?" he cried, breathing heavily. "I say, young man, your clothes! If a lady were to chance to see you—" He broke off, his eyes opening wide with recognition. "Goodness, my lord! 'Tis you!" "2 men broke into Miss Boleyn's house. I chased one of them here. Did you see where he went?" The watchman lifted his gaze to the rooftops and kept it there. "I heard running footsteps, my lord, but I never saw anyone. Check up and down the street. He may have ducked down someone's area steps or be hiding in the shadows of a doorway." The watchman kept his gaze carefully averted. "Yes, my lord." Sebastian started to turn away, but hesitated long enough to say, "By the way, there's a dead body at Miss Boleyn's house. You'll need to send someone to deal with it." "Yes, my lord." Sebastian swung back toward Kat's house. As he crossed the garden, he could see the house ablaze with lights, hear a crescendo of female voices coming from inside. Climbing through the window again, he rummaged through the sideboard until he found a tablecloth to drape around his hips. He found Kat, Elspeth, and the cook clustered in the first-floor hall. The man Sebastian had hit with the poker lay near the base of the stairs from the second floor. Blood splattered the walls of the stairwell and the banister, and soaked into the carpet. Sebastian took one look at what was left of the man's head, and wished he'd thought to bring another tablecloth. Kat came to stand beside him, her hands wrapping around his arm as she stared down at the man at her feet. Her face was white, but he suspected it was more from anger than fear. "It's Jarvis, isn't it? He sent these men." Sebastian forced himself to take another look at the face of the man he'd killed. He studied the even features, the fan of smile lines at the edges of the widely staring eyes, and knew a flicker of surprise. "No, it's the man who threatened me outside my aunt's house last Monday." Hunkering down, he searched quickly through the man's pockets, but found nothing of interest. This had nothing to do with Jarvis. Lord Stanton, perhaps, or Sir Humphrey Carmichael, or perhaps someone else who doesn't like the questions I've been asking. But not Jarvis. "How many were there?" "2. The other one got away." He turned to head upstairs. "I need to get some clothes on. The watch should be here soon to deal with this fellow." She followed him, carefully lifting the hem of her dressing gown as she stepped over the bloody corpse on her stairs. "You're certain it's the same man you saw before?" "Yes." He pulled his shirt over his head and reached for his breeches. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Where are you going?"
"To have a little talk with Lord Stanton." The sun was still a mere promise on the horizon when Sebastian popped the lock on the library window of Lord Stanton's Park Street townhouse and dropped inside. He moved easily through the darkened house, hugging the wall on his way up the stairs to keep the steps from creaking. Lady Stanton had been advised by her doctors to retire to the country in an attempt to ease her prostration of grief. Only one of the bedrooms on the second floor, an opulent chamber overlooking the rear garden, was occupied. Lord Stanton slept on his back in a gilded tester bed with red velvet hangings. Beneath the figured red coverlet, his heavy chest rose and fell rhythmically, his lips parting with each exhalation. Snagging a lyre-backed chair, Sebastian brought it reversed close to the bed's edge and straddled the seat. He pressed the muzzle of his small flintlock pistol into the hollow beneath the man's jawbone and waited. The rhythmic breathing stopped on a strangled gasp. Stanton's eyes flew open, then fixed wide on the pistol. Sebastian showed his teeth in a smile. "I trust you can see well enough to know what this is?" Stanton nodded, his tongue flicking out to moisten his lips. "Someone tried to kill me tonight. Not just me, but my future wife as well. That was a serious error." Stanton's voice was admirably strong and controlled. "If they told you I hired them, they lied." Sebastian frowned. "Odd. I don't recall mentioning that there was more than one of them. But as it happens, there were two. One is now a bloody mess on Miss Boleyn's staircase. The other, regrettably, escaped." Something flashed in the Baron's eyes, then was gone. "This is the second time in the past few days that someone has tried to kill me. I must say it's getting rather fatiguing." "You're obviously making yourself unpopular." "So it would seem." "I keep thinking about our encounter in Whitehall the other day. You struck me at the time as a man with a secret, a terrible secret, he was willing to do almost anything to keep from becoming known." Stanton stared back at him, his lips pressed tight, his narrowed eyes radiating hatred and contained fury. Sebastian leaned forward and dropped his voice to a whisper. "I don't know it all yet, but I'm getting close. At this point, I'm thinking it doesn't matter whether it was you or Sir Humphrey Carmichael or someone I haven't even met yet who sent those men into Miss Boleyn's house. But if any of you threatens her again in any way, you're dead. It's as simple as that. You're mad. I doubt you're the first to think so." Sebastian withdrew the gun and stood. "I could call the watch on you," said Stanton, his fists tightening on the covers at his chest. Sebastian smiled and backed toward the door. "You could, but that would direct attention precisely where you don't want it now, wouldn't it?" Chapter 45. Saturday, 21st of September, 1811. Sebastian's sister lived in an elegant townhouse on St. James's Square. The house technically belonged to her son, the young Lord Wilcox, for Amanda was recently widowed. But Lady Wilcox ruled both her son Bayard and her 17-year-old daughter Stephanie with brutal purpose and an iron will. Sebastian found her in the morning room, arranging white and yellow lilies in a large vase. She was a tall woman and thin, with their mother's pale blonde hair still only barely touched by grey, although she was 12 years Sebastian's senior. She looked up without smiling at his entrance. "I trust you are here to tell me the notice in this morning's papers was an error." "You saw it, did you?" She set down the last lily with enough force that the rings on her hand clattered against the marble tabletop. "Dear God, it's true?" "Yes." Her jaw hardened with cold fury. "You do realize that Stephanie's coming out is less than 6 months away?" Sebastian controlled the impulse to laugh. Console yourself with the thought that most of the talk will have died down by then.
She studied him with one brow thoughtfully arched. How did Hendon take it?
Predictably. He has promised never to darken my doorway again. I presume you intend to do the same.
As long as that woman is your wife, I should think so. Sebastian nodded.
I'll bid you good day, then.
And he walked out of her house and out of her life. Sir Henry Lovejoy was at his desk, glancing over the coming day's schedule when Viscount Devlin arrived at his office. Henry sat back. "Good morning, my lord, and congratulations." He permitted himself a small smile. "I saw the announcement of your upcoming nuptials in the paper this morning." The young Viscount was looking oddly strained, but Lovejoy supposed that was to be expected in one about to embark upon such a life-altering event.
"Some men broke into Miss Boleyn's house last night and tried to kill us."
"Merciful heavens! Do you know who they were?"
Devlin shook his head. "Hirelings. You received the list of passengers and ship's officers I sent yesterday?"
Yes.
Henry opened a drawer and pulled out a report.
"Please, my lord, take a seat. I have my constable's notes right here. Of the ship's officers, the second mate," Henry consulted his constable's notes, "Mr. Fairfax, died 4 years ago from a fall."
"A fall?"
"Yes, from a third-floor window in Naples. There was some speculation Mr. Fairfax may have deliberately thrown himself from the window, but as the gentleman was in his cups at the time, it was impossible to say." Henry consulted the notes again. "The third mate, Mr. Francis Hillard, was lost overboard while at sea off the Canary Islands 2 years ago, while the first mate, Mr. Canning, drank himself to death 6 months ago. A most unlucky lot from the sounds of things."
Devlin grunted.
"And the passengers?" "The spinster Miss Elizabeth Ware died 2 years ago of hysteria."
"Hysteria?"
Henry nodded. "The constable spoke to her sister. Seems the poor woman went mad not long after her return to London. Stark, raving mad. As for Mr. and Mrs. Dunlop, they were living in Golden Square up until several weeks ago, but they appear to have packed and fled the city somewhat precipitously. That leaves only Mr. Felix Atkinson of the East India Company. He lives with his wife and 2 children in a house in Portland Place."
"Have you spoken to him?"
Henry slid the paper with the address across the desk to the Viscount. "I am no longer a part of the investigation, remember?" The Viscount smiled and rose to leave. "There is one other thing," said Henry. Devlin paused.
"Yes?"
"Captain Quayle. I've had another of my constables checking into his whereabouts on the nights of each of the murders. And it seems the captain was neither at home nor with the Horse Guards on any of the nights in question." Henry peeled his glasses off his nose and rubbed the bridge. "I also looked into the captain's activities in the army. I understand why you suspected him."
"But there's no connection between Quayle and the Harmony. At least, not that I know of."
"No." Henry replaced his glasses and reached for his schedule again. "There does not appear to be, does there?" Sebastian was halfway across the entrance hall of his Brook Street house, heading toward the stairs, when his major-domo cleared his throat apologetically. "I trust you have not forgotten, my lord, that you have an interview with a gentleman's gentleman scheduled for this morning." Sebastian paused with one foot on the bottom step, his hand on the newel post. "What? Good God! I've taken the liberty of putting the gentleman in the library." Suppressing an oath, Sebastian turned toward the library. The prospective valet proved to be a tall, cadaverously thin man with a bony face and prominent thick lips.
"My apologies for keeping you waiting,"
said Sebastian, reaching for the valet's credentials. Sebastian was heartily sick of this entire hiring process. Unless this candidate engaged in pagan sacrifices or wiped his nose on his sleeve, Sebastian was determined to hire him. "I understand you were most recently employed by Lord Bingham." The gentleman's gentleman inclined his head.
"That is correct."
"And why precisely did you leave Lord Bingham's service?"
"I'm afraid Lord Bingham shot himself last Tuesday."
Sebastian looked up. He vaguely recalled hearing something about Lord Bingham earlier in the week, but had been too preoccupied to pay it much heed. "Right. Well, tell me—" The sounds of an altercation in the hall reached them through the library's closed door. Tom's ringing Cockney tones blending with Morrie's hissed, "Not now, he's with—" The door burst open and Tom catapulted into the room. "Wait till you hear this, Governor. I've been looking into that cove Quayle, and you know how he told you he didn't know Barclay Carmichael? Well, it seems Carmichael won 500 quid off him at Faro night afore Carmichael was found butchered in the park last summer." The valet's already pale skin bleached white.
"Merciful heavens! It's true what they say."
Sebastian swung to look at the man.
What? What do they say?"
The valet pushed to his feet and back toward the door, his hat gripped tightly in both hands.
"That you involve yourself in murder."
Sebastian rose from behind his desk and took a step forward. "Yes, but never mind that. You're hired. You can start work today. My major domo will show you—" But the gentleman's gentleman had already bolted through the door. "He didn't want him anyway," said Tom with a sniff. "He looked like a queer cove to me."
"All I get is queer coves. Obviously, because word has gone out amongst the gentleman's gentlemen of the city that I am a queer cove."
Tom sniffed again. "I checked before I come here. Quayle's at his house, in Kensington, just off Notting Hill Gate. Want I should get the curricle?"